I only needed shelter. But this broken workshop seemed to recognize my hands.
She was 19 and alone. No bedroom. No porch light. No one waiting for her name at supper. Just a cracked canvas duffel and $4 she had earned sorting bruised peaches behind a roadside stand. And with that $4, she bought a decoy carver's shack on cedar pilings in the salt marsh beyond Chincoteague Island, Accomack County, Virginia, where Cedar Hammock Landing had fallen off county maps in 1958. The north sill had rotted until it bowed like a tired knee. The roof leaked through tar paper patched with license plates. The county had condemned it since 1997 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the false bottom of a hand-worn tool chest, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Mae Whitaker had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited in kitchens where the linoleum curled at the corners and the morning light came weakly through flour-dusted glass. She had waited in the back seat of borrowed cars while adults spoke in low voices beside open hoods. She had waited outside church basements in towns whose names sounded alike after a while, places with feed stores, coin laundries, and one slow traffic light blinking red after midnight. She had learned early that waiting was not the empty thing people called it. Waiting had weight. It required hands that could fold themselves and stay folded. It required a mouth that did not ask too often. Her mother, Elaine, had been a narrow woman with quick wrists and tired shoes. She worked wherever work would take her, folding motel sheets in Crisfield, trimming onions at a seafood house near Pocomoke, standing behind the register at a gas station where the coffee burned down to black syrup by noon. Clara had known her mother mostly by the smell of soap, fryer oil, and rainwater in wool. Elaine did not sing in the mornings. She did not complain at night. She moved through each rented room as though she was careful not to leave marks. There had been no father in the way other children meant the word. There was a name on a certificate kept in a plastic folder, and there were 2 photographs with the faces creased from being carried too long in a purse. Clara had once asked whether he had liked the water, because one picture showed him standing by a dock, one hand raised against sun. Elaine had looked at the photograph for so long that Clara understood the question had gone somewhere deeper than speech. He liked anything that could leave, her mother had said. After that, Clara did not ask again. What she did have, for a while, was her mother's father, Elias Ward, who lived at the edge of a tidal creek where Maryland softened into marsh and marsh into sky. He was not a large man, but he had a way of occupying a room, honestly, as if every chair, every nail, every cup on the shelf had already made peace with him. His hair had gone white before Clara could remember it any other colour. His hands were square and scarred, the nails darkened from cedar dust and oil paint that never quite washed out. On Saturdays, when Elaine could spare the bus fare or borrow a ride, Clara stayed with him from dawn until Sunday evening. Elias carved decoys, not the bright souvenir ducks sold beside postcards and saltwater taffy, but working birds shaped for wind, water, and distance. His shed smelled of Atlantic white cedar, turpentine, linseed oil, and the faint iron breath of old tools. There were patterns traced on brown paper, breast forms stacked on shelves, heads blocked roughly in pine before being refined in cedar, glass eyes kept in tobacco tins, and jars of pigment labelled in his deliberate hand: burnt umber, yellow ochre, lamp black, Prussian blue, raw sienna. He never rushed the first cut. On cold mornings he would set 2 mugs of weak coffee on the bench, one for himself and one mostly milk for Clara, and begin by choosing wood. He would tap the billet with his knuckle, listening. Then he would turn it, weighing grain and hidden knots. Clara had once tried to hurry him by pointing at the pencil pattern and asking whether the bird was inside already. Elias had smiled without showing teeth. Everything honest waits for the hand that can hear it. He said it once, and she carried it like a smooth stone in her pocket. For Elias, that sentence meant the wood had its own patience. It meant the maker's first duty was not to impose, but to listen closely enough that what was already there could become visible. For Clara, though she did not have language for it then, it meant a person could be overlooked for years and still remain unruined. It meant silence was not the same as emptiness. It meant careful work could be a kind of love. Their weekend ritual never changed if weather allowed. Saturday morning was for rough shaping. Elias clamped the cedar block to the scarred bench and let Clara hold the pattern flat while he traced the curve of a black duck's back or the lowered head of a canvasback riding hard weather. He used a draw knife when he wanted long obedient shavings. He used a rasp when he wanted the surface to remember resistance. By noon, the floor was pale with curls and sunlight through the single window made the dust appear almost golden. After lunch, usually beans, cornbread and stewed tomatoes from a jar, he let her sand the bodies smooth with folded paper. He taught her to sand with the grain, never across it unless there was damage to humble down. He taught her that a decoy must sit low enough to be trusted by water and high enough to carry its own shadow. He showed her how to balance lead ballast, how to bore a clean hole for a leather anchor thong, how to soften a breastline until it looked simple. The simplest lines took the longest. On Sundays, he painted. Clara loved that part best, though she was made to wait before touching a brush. Elias mixed his own oil colours on a scrap of window glass, grinding pigment into linseed until the paste shone. He did not paint feathers one by one at first. He laid down tone, then warmth, then breath. A mallard hen began as a brown body, plain and humble, and only later received the delicate chevrons that made her seem alive. A drake's green head was never only green. It held blue in shadow, black under the bill, and a hidden amber near the eye that could only be seen when the decoy turned toward light. Paint what keeps the bird alive, he told her. Not what proves you worked hard. He had rules for everything. Knives were wiped before they were put down. Brushes were suspended, never crushed in jars. Sandpaper was folded twice, not wadded. Paint rags lay flat outside until dry, because oil could heat itself in darkness and burn a building down while decent people slept. Clara listened to each rule as though it had been carved for her alone. In those years, the world made sense in his shed. Outside it, things were less exact. Elaine remarried when Clara was 14, not in a church but at the courthouse on a Tuesday with rain beading on the windows. The man's name was Vernon Pike. He wore pressed shirts and polished shoes, and he spoke with a politeness that made people glance down at themselves. He worked selling used appliances, then boats, then estate lots. Though the details shifted depending on who was listening, he had a habit of straightening objects on tables that did not belong to him. Salt shaker, napkin holder, another man's mail. At first he called Clara young lady, as if distance were a courtesy. He brought Elaine flowers wrapped in cellophane from the grocery store and paid one overdue bill in cash, laying the receipt on the counter where it could be seen. The rented house changed under him. Curtains went up. Cheap lamps appeared with plastic shades, the refrigerator filled with labelled containers. Vernon liked labels. He liked drawers that closed cleanly, shoes in a row, papers signed in blue ink. He did not shout. That would have made him easier to understand. Instead, he corrected the air around him until everyone breathed smaller. He asked Clara why she walked so softly, then later why she made noise on the stairs. He told Elaine she was too trusting, then told her she was too suspicious. He praised Clara's schoolwork by saying it was a pity she had no ambition beyond books and that useless whittling. When Elias sent home a shoebox of cedar blanks and a good spokeshave wrapped in newspaper, Vernon lifted the tool between two fingers. "Sentimental clutter," he said, and set it on the porch. Elaine brought it back in after he went to bed, but not before rain had darkened one corner of the wrapping. Clara kept visiting Elias as long as she could, then Elaine's shifts changed. Vernon sold the second car and bus routes became expensive in the exact way. Poverty makes even small distances feel guarded. Clara saw her grandfather fewer times that year, then fewer still. He wrote postcards in a hand that grew larger and more uneven. The cards showed ponies on Assateague, crab houses painted white, a lighthouse under hard blue sky. On the back, he wrote plain things. Sand the teal with 220 before primer. Do not trust cheap varnish near salt air. Saw a flight of brant at sunrise. Wish you had seen it. The last time Clara stayed with him, she was 17. It was late October, and the marsh grass had gone the colour of tobacco. Elias moved more slowly, but he still rose before light and set coffee on the bench. He let her paint the flank feathers on a black duck that had been ordered by a man who hunted only twice a year and talked as if he had invented weather. Clara's hands trembled at first. Elias did not correct her. He simply turned the glass palette nearer to her elbow. By evening, the little bird had come alive in layers, brown into black into soft violet where the wing caught light. Elias sat beside her and looked at it for a long while. "You waited," he said. That was all. 3 months later, he died in the first hard freeze of January. No one called it sudden because old men were expected to go eventually, but to Clara the word eventually had always seemed like a far country. Elaine cried without sound at the funeral, one hand pressed to her mouth. Vernon wore a dark overcoat and spoke to neighbours with lowered gravity, accepting casseroles as if grief had made him temporary host of a public event. Clara stood near the closed casket and looked at Elias's hands folded over a borrowed tie. Someone had scrubbed the paint from his nails. Afterward came the dividing. There was not much money, people said, but there were objects, and objects had a way of revealing who believed memory could be priced. Elias's cottage had been rented land, his truck barely running, his bank account modest enough to disappear under hospital bills. The decoy patterns, tools, half-finished birds, pigment jars, notebooks, clamps, cedar planks, glass eyes, and the black duck Clara had painted were carried out in boxes by men who owned auction vans. Vernon handled the conversation with the estate man. Elaine stood in the doorway holding a folded tissue. Clara was told there was no use making a scene over things that would gather dust. She took only what she could hide beneath her coat. One dull carving knife with Elias's initials burned into the handle, a sanding block, and a postcard of the Chincoteague lighthouse with 3 words written on the back: "Keep your hand." For 2 years after that, Clara finished high school by arriving early and leaving through side doors. She worked wherever a 19-year-old girl with no car could work. She washed dishes at a diner until her wrists cracked from bleach. She swept hair at a salon where women talked over her as though brooms did not have ears. She sorted produce, folded church rummage clothes, stacked bait buckets, and once spent 2 weeks cleaning rental cottages that smelled of mildew and suntan lotion. Every envelope of cash went into an old coffee tin hidden behind the furnace. Then Elaine became ill in the slow, bewildering way that makes rooms fill with medicine bottles before anyone admits the shape of what is coming. There were appointments, then fewer appointments because money ran out, then a final week when the house settled into a silence so deep Clara could hear the clock in the kitchen change its mind before each tick. Her mother did not speak much at the end. She watched Clara move around the bed, watched her fold towels, watched her spoon broth that cooled too quickly. Vernon kept papers on the kitchen table. He came and went with a clipboard, a pen, and the careful patience of a man waiting for rain to stop before selling the umbrella. After the funeral, while the flowers were still on folding tables in the church hall, and Clara's black dress smelled faintly of storage, he placed documents before her. He said there were bills, he said Elaine had made choices, he said grown people must be practical. The house, he told her, had been in her mother's name once, but obligations had gathered like tidewater. There were signatures needed to settle matters cleanly. Clara had been awake for nearly 2 days. The pen he gave her was silver-coloured and too heavy. Her hand moved where he pointed. Elaine's face looked down from a framed photograph on the sideboard, the one taken before Vernon, before illness, before the bones in her cheeks sharpened. In the photograph, her mother was not smiling, but she had not yet learned to look away. Clara signed. Only later did she understand that the paper surrendered any claim she had to the house Elaine meant to leave her. By then Vernon had already arranged the sale of furniture, dishes, quilts, a cedar chest, and the remaining photographs from her mother's side. He called it clearing. He called it necessary. He called it mercy toward the past. The eviction came on a Thursday morning in March, when frost still silvered the weeds along the fence. Clara had packed 3 grocery bags and the cracked canvas duffel. Into the duffel went 2 shirts, 1 wool sweater, socks darned at the toe, Elias's knife wrapped in a dish towel, the sanding block, 3 postcards, her birth certificate, and a glass jar containing $23.70. She had placed her mother's chipped blue mixing bowl beside the door, meaning to carry it last because Elaine had used it for biscuits when flour was cheap enough to waste on tenderness. Vernon lifted the bowl before she could reach it. He held it lightly, as though deciding whether it had any value. "This house does not belong to you any more." 8 words. He set the bowl in a cardboard box marked kitchen lot. Clara looked at her mother's photograph still hanging crookedly on the wall. Vernon had left it there because buyers liked a house to seem lived in until the papers passed. Elaine's eyes, fixed in that flat paper light, did not move toward her daughter. They did not plead, they did not explain. They simply remained where Vernon had allowed them to remain, framed, silent, and already belonging to the house more than to the girl standing in the doorway. Clara did not take the photograph. She picked up the duffel and walked out before her knees could fail her. The porch boards were damp. A robin hopped once beneath the hedge and stabbed at the cold earth. Behind her, the door closed with care, not force, which somehow made the sound worse. For 6 weeks she lived between towns, because staying in one place made people remember enough to ask. She slept the first 3 nights in the covered bed of a disabled pickup behind an auto shop outside Pocomoke City, curled beneath a tarp that smelled of gasoline and mouse droppings. The owner found her on the 4th morning and did not call anyone. He only said she could not remain, then gave her a paper cup of coffee and turned his back long enough for her to leave with dignity. She walked to Snow Hill, following the shoulder where ditch water reflected pale sky. There she slept behind the volunteer firehouse beneath an overhang that kept off rain but not wind. Her jar went from $23.70 to $18.10 after bread, peanut butter, aspirin, and laundromat quarters. She washed in public restrooms using paper towels dampened under cold taps, and learned which mirrors had lights that made a person look less gone. In Salisbury, she spent 2 nights in a 24-hour bus station until a security guard with kind eyes and tired rules told her she had to have a ticket to sit there after midnight. He let her remain until 3 in the morning because rain was falling hard enough to flatten the cigarette ends in the gutter. Before she left, he slid a bruised apple across the counter without looking at her. By then, her shoes had begun to split at the side seam. She took dishwashing work for 5 days at a crab house near Westover, paid in cash because the owner did not want paperwork, and Clara did not have the strength to insist on fairness. She slept in an unused shed where bus tubs were stacked for winter. The shed smelled of Old Bay seasoning, rope, and thawing bait. At night, rats moved behind the walls with busy private certainty. She kept Elias's knife beneath her palm until morning. Her money rose to $31, then fell again. A blister opened on her heel outside Princess Anne and bled into the sock. She bought gauze, tape, and a carton of milk, $26, then a hot meal at a church supper where no one asked her name, only whether she wanted more beans, $22. Then a thrift store coat because April rain on the eastern shore could still enter a body like winter, $14.65. The last week she found shelter in the cargo space of a delivery van that had been abandoned behind a tire shop near Onencock. One back door hung crooked, but the roof did not leak if she slept along the left side with her knees drawn up. She arranged cardboard beneath her, folded the thrift coat for a pillow, and listened to trucks pass on Route 13 like distant surf. Every morning she swept the van floor with a pine branch so no one could tell she had been there. Every night she climbed inside after dark and pulled the door nearly shut. Hunger made time exact. She counted coins before buying anything. She learned the price of 1 banana, 1 hard roll, 1 can of soup, 1 cup of coffee when bought near closing. She learned which clerks looked through her and which looked too closely. She learned that shame was loudest when a person had done nothing wrong. On the 42nd day, rain drove her into the public library in Accomack. The building was warm in the careful civic way of libraries, not generous but steady. Heat came through floor vents with a dusty whisper. The carpet had worn paths between shelves. A woman at the desk looked up, registered Clara's wet coat and the duffel strap cutting across her shoulder, then looked back down without making her leave. That kindness was so plain, Clara nearly turned around. She walked first to the restroom where she washed her hands twice and pressed water over her hair. Then she moved between shelves until she found a table near the local history section, half hidden by a rotating rack of tax forms. Her body wanted sleep, but sleeping in public was how a person became a problem, so she took a newspaper from a wooden rod and opened it because reading looked acceptable. The classified page had been folded inward. There were notices for yard sales, crab pots, hay, a freezer that ran fine, a church organ free if hauled, a litter of beagle pups, and county surplus properties listed in narrow type. Most were parcels too wet to build on, tax claims, slivers of land behind roads, collapsed sheds, and one line that caught because of the price: cedar hammock decoy shack. Chincoteague Marsh. A.S. is. Public bid minimum $4. Clara read it once, then lowered the paper and looked toward the windows. Rain streaked the glass until the courthouse across the street appeared to be underwater. The word decoy did not call to her loudly. It simply opened a door she had thought had been nailed shut. There was a phone number for the county clerk, and a note that bids under $10 must be made in person with exact cash. The property was condemned. No utilities guaranteed. Access limited. Buyer assumes all risk. Demolition pending if unsold after 30 days. Clara had $4 left. Not $4 and change, 4 $1 bills folded into the lining pocket of her coat, kept separate from coins because bills felt more serious. She had meant to buy bread, maybe a jar of peanut butter, if the discount shelf had one with a dented lid. Instead, she sat in the library with wet cuffs against her wrists and read the line again, until the words settled into their own strange order. Cedar. Decoy. Shack. Chincoteague. $4. The librarian came by once and set a scrap of paper on the table. It was not a warning. It was the phone number copied more clearly, with the courthouse address written beneath it in careful blue ink. Office closes at 4, the woman said. Clara looked up. Thank you. The librarian nodded and went back to her desk, leaving behind the faint smell of hand lotion and dust. For another 10 minutes, Clara did not move. She was not deciding in the way people decide between two good roads. There was no second road. There was only the delivery van with its bent door, the diminishing body, the mother's bowl in a stranger's auction box, and a word from her grandfather's world lying in newsprint, like something kept alive beneath ash. At last she folded the newspaper along its original crease and returned it to the wooden rack. She went to the restroom, took the 4 bills from her coat lining, and smoothed them beneath the hand dryer. Each bill fluttered hard in the hot air, green and worn and thin as leaves. Then she put them inside her birth certificate folder so they would not soften in the rain. She walked out of the library carrying everything she owned. The courthouse stood 2 blocks away, brick darkened by weather, white columns streaked with grey, cars hissed past on wet pavement. Clara's shoes took in water through the split seam, and the duffel knocked against her hip with each step. She passed a law office, a memorial bench, a magnolia just beginning to leaf, and a man smoking under an awning who glanced at her once and then away. At the courthouse door, she paused only long enough to wipe mud from her soles. Inside, there would be forms, warnings, a brass stamp, and a woman behind a counter who knew more than she first admitted. Beyond that, across miles of wet road and marsh grass, something forgotten stood on cedar pilings and waited without lights, without heat, without welcome. Clara opened the door and stepped in. The bus left Accomac with rain still needling the windows, and by the time it crossed toward the island, the sky had lowered until the marsh seemed to be holding up the whole weather. Clara sat 2 seats behind the driver with the duffel pressed between her feet and the damp thrift coat folded over her lap. The bus smelled of vinyl warmed by bodies, diesel, wet wool, and the faint sourness of forgotten coffee. A woman ahead of her carried 2 plastic grocery bags filled with cans that tapped softly together whenever the road buckled. A boy in a baseball jacket slept with his forehead against the glass. The driver wore fingerless gloves and hummed under his breath without ever finding the tune. Outside, the eastern shore unrolled in low fields and dark ditches. Farmhouses stood back from the road with their windows pale. Mailboxes leaned bare crepe. Myrtles lifted their tangled branches beside yards where boats sat on trailers, tarped and waiting for warmer months. Now and then Clara saw a narrow creek shining between reeds, and beyond that the long silvery flats where water and land could not seem to finish deciding which they were. She did not sleep. Her body wanted to, but there are kinds of exhaustion too guarded for rest. She watched each road sign pass because names gave shape to distance. Parksley, Nelsonia, Temperanceville, then the long reach toward Wallops, where sky opened around antennas and low government buildings, and gulls flew as if the wind belonged to them by law. When the bus turned east toward Chincoteague, the rain began to break apart. At the small transfer stop near the island road, the driver told her the next ride would not come until morning. "You got someone meeting you?" She shook her head. He looked at her shoes, then at the duffel, then out toward the grey sweep of road. "Cold night, yes, sir." He reached behind his seat and handed her a paper napkin wrapped around 2 crackers from a diner packet and half a peppermint. He did not make kindness into a speech. He only gave it and shut the folding door. The bus pulled away in a sigh of brakes. By late afternoon she had walked 3 miles along the shoulder, the duffel strap cutting into the same tender place again and again. The air smelled of brine, mud, and rain loosening from cedar branches. Cars passed rarely, and when they did, she stepped down into the grass and stood still until the water settled back into the ditch. Crows moved over the fields in crooked lines. In the distance, she could see the faint white lift of boats stored behind houses. She stopped once beneath a roadside pine and ate the crackers slowly, letting each bite soften before she swallowed. The peppermint she kept in her pocket. It seemed too bright a thing to spend all at once. As evening came, the temperature fell to 37 degrees. She knew because a farm supply sign near a crossroads flashed the numbers in red above an advertisement for oyster cages and propane refills, 37, then 36 when the wind shifted. The figures blinked over and over, impartial and exact. A mile beyond that sign, she found the hay barn. It stood behind a field where winter wheat had only begun to green the rows. The barn leaned but had not surrendered. Its sliding door was open by a width just large enough for a narrow person and a duffel. Clara stood outside for a long minute, listening. No dog barked. No truck turned down the lane. The house beyond the field had no lights in the downstairs windows. Inside, the barn held darkness softened by the smell of hay, dust, and old grain. She climbed to the loft by a ladder whose rungs had been polished by generations of hands and boots. There were square bales stacked to one side beneath a roof that clicked when the wind pressed it. She made a hollow between 2 bales, pushed the duffel in first, then crawled behind it and pulled loose hay over her legs. The hay scratched through her stockings, but it held warmth better than cardboard. A barn is never silent at night. Boards shift, mice conduct their small business, wind finds nail holes and speaks through them. Somewhere below, a chain tapped against metal in a deliberate rhythm, as though the dark were counting down. Clara kept Elias's knife folded in her hand, not because she expected harm, but because the worn handle knew the shape of her palm. She slept in broken pieces. At dawn, frost silvered the rim of the loft opening. Her breath had dampened the collar of her coat. She climbed down stiffly, shook hay from her skirt, and used both hands to lower the duffel so it would not thud against the floor. Outside, the field had gone pale and exact under morning cold. The temperature on the farm sign, when she passed it again, read 34. She walked the remaining miles toward town as the eastern sky cleared. Chincoteague announced itself modestly, not with a grand gate, not with a sudden main street shining under banners, but with houses set close to the road, boats in yards, crab pots stacked beside sheds, and the smell of tidal water coming in clean cold sheets. There were pickup trucks with salt along their fenders and bicycles chained to porch rails. A church bell sounded once, then stopped, as if testing the morning. She passed 5 businesses before finding the county clerk's satellite office near the civic building. The first was Heron's Wake Diner, with steamed windows and a hand-painted breakfast sign that promised eggs, grits, and scrapple. A waitress inside wiped a counter in slow circles while a man in a seed cap read a newspaper folded into quarters. Next came Boline Bait and Marine, where orange net floats hung above the door and a chalkboard listed bloodworms, eel rigs, and used anchors. Beside it stood Miss June's Wash and Fold, its dryers turning behind glass with a soft yellow thump. Farther along, Cedar Creek Pharmacy displayed cough syrup, postcards, and reading glasses in the window. At the corner was Island Hardware and Feed, a deep, narrow building with galvanized tubs outside, seed packets clipped to a wire rack, and storm windows stacked like pages of a heavy book. Clara stopped before the diner longer than she meant to. The smell from its vent reached the sidewalk, bacon fat and coffee and something sweet browning on a griddle. She put one hand over her middle and waited for the wanting to pass into something manageable. It did eventually. Wanting usually did if there was no answer for it. The clerk's office occupied 2 rooms in a low brick building with a flagpole out front and a camellia bush pressed close to the wall. Rainwater stood in the cracks of the walkway. Inside, the floor was dull tile, clean at the centre and darkened near the edges where no mop could quite reach. A bulletin board held notices for boat ramp permits, mosquito control, shellfish closures, and a flyer asking for volunteers to help with marsh bird counts in May. At the counter sat a woman whose hair was the colour of pewter and pinned in a coil so exact it seemed to have been measured. She wore a green cardigan over a white blouse, rimless glasses, and a nameplate that read MRS Olmer Pritchard, Deputy Clerk. Beside the nameplate stood a brass date stamp, a jar of black pens, and a ceramic dish shaped like an oyster shell, empty except for 2 paper clips. Mrs. Pritchard looked up when Clara entered. Her gaze moved over the wet shoes, the duffel, the careful posture of someone trying not to take up more room than permitted. She did not soften, she did not harden either. Her face had the composed neutrality of a person who had witnessed more private calamity at counters than any citizen ever intended to bring. You're here about something filed. Yes, ma'am. Marriage license, record copy, tax map, bid notice. Clara opened the folder that held her birth certificate and the classified line copied on library paper. She slid the scrap across the counter. Mrs. Pritchard picked it up. For 1 second nothing changed. Then her eyes returned to the line, and her mouth pressed itself into a narrower shape. That parcel. Yes. Ma'am. You understand what this is? Clara stood with both hands on the folder. Her fingers had gone stiff from cold, but she kept them flat. I think so. Mrs. Pritchard removed her glasses and placed them beside the stamp. No. I will need you to understand it before I take your signature. Yes. Ma'am. The clerk reached beneath the counter and brought out a file tied with faded cotton tape. It had been handled so often, or so little over so many years, that the edges had furred. She untied it with deliberate care and withdrew a tax map, a condemnation notice, 3 photographs, and a form printed on pale green paper. The structure is unsafe. Yes. Ma'am. No utilities are active or guaranteed. Yes. Ma'am. There is no road maintenance beyond the public portion. Yes. Ma'am. The pilings may fail under weight. Yes. Ma'am. The county is not responsible for injury, loss, vermin, weather, tide, fire, mold, broken glass, roof collapse, or any other condition present before or after purchase. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard looked at her over the top of the file. It is not a house in any comfortable meaning of that word. Clara kept her eyes on the green paper. No. Ma'am. And once recorded, this office does not buy back mistakes. No. Ma'am. The clerk sat back. The office clock above the bulletin board clicked toward 10. Through the wall came the faint sound of a copier starting, pausing, starting again, as if someone in the next room had lost patience with a machine and was trying to remain dignified about it. You have seen the property? No. Ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard blinked once. You have not seen it. No. Ma'am. You have someone advising you. No. Ma'am. You have somewhere to stay tonight? Clara's thumb moved once against the edge of the folder. She did not answer quickly enough. Mrs. Pritchard put her glasses back on. That was not an official question. No. Ma'am. The clerk watched her for a moment longer. Then she took the green form and turned it around. Print your legal name here. Sign here. Date here. Initial beside each condition. The bid has to be cash. Exact. I cannot make change for county surplus. Clara reached into the folder and withdrew the flattened bills without naming them. They lay on the counter like leaves that had survived a hard winter. Mrs. Pritchard counted them once, then again, not because the count was difficult, but because procedure deserved its own grave little ceremony. She wrote a receipt by hand, pressing firmly enough for the carbon copy beneath to take. The pen felt lighter than Vernon's. Clara printed carefully. Her letters looked strange in that office, as if they belonged to a person more certain than herself. She initialed each warning. Unsafe. No utilities. Limited access. No warranty. Buyer assumes all risk. Then she signed, Mrs. Pritchard pulled the document toward herself, aligned it against the edge of the counter, and lifted the brass stamp. The sound it made when it struck the paper was deep and final. A small courthouse thunder. Recorded. The clerk wrote the book and page number in a square near the top. She added the receipt, separated the copies, and placed the county's bills in the oyster-shell dish for a moment before locking them inside a drawer. Clara saw that the top bill had a corner darkened from being dried too close to the library hand-dryer. Then the drawer closed. You will need directions, Mrs. Pritchard said. Yes, ma'am. She drew a map on the back of an outdated mosquito notice, not hurriedly, and not as if she expected Clara to understand it all at once. She marked Main Street, then the turn toward Maddox Boulevard, then a county lane that thinned into an access track, used mostly by marsh wardens, oystermen, and people who knew better than to drive there after a spring tide. She wrote the name Cedar Hammock in the margin, then paused with the pen lifted. That name has not been used on most public maps for a long while, she said. Clara looked at the letters. My grandfather had a postcard from here. The clerk's hand stopped. Did he? Yes. Ma'am. What was his line of work? Clara hesitated. Not because it was secret, but because some answers carry the dead into a room. He carved working birds. Mrs. Pritchard's face changed very slightly. It was not surprise. It was recognition moving through careful habits. There were ward men up the coast who carved fine black ducks, she said. One of them used to come through here for cedar and eyes when I was a girl. He had a way of holding a block of wood like he was listening to a child breathing. Clara did not move. The clerk looked down at the deed, then at the surname printed among Clara's papers, then back toward the rain-bright window behind her desk. Well, she said, after a settled silence. That explains the hand. Clara looked at her own hands on the counter. They were red, chapped, and not especially steady. Mrs. Pritchard opened another drawer and removed a keyring with 2 keys. Both tagged in pencil, though the writing had faded. One key was ordinary brass. The other was iron, dark and thick, made for an older lock. She placed them beside the deed. I cannot promise either one still works. Yes, ma'am. There used to be a sign nailed over the door. If it has fallen, watch where you step. Some of the porch planks are likely only pretending. Yes, ma'am. If the tide is over the lower boards, do not go in. Wait. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard folded the deed copy and placed it in a brown envelope. Then, as though annoyed by herself, she reached into the bottom drawer and took out a packet of cheese crackers, a county emergency blanket sealed in plastic, and a pencil stub. These are not county surplus, she said. They are from my desk. Clara's throat moved. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. You may curse my name before dark. No, ma'am. For the first time, the corner of Mrs. Pritchard's mouth moved almost toward a smile, then thought better of it. Go before the afternoon tide turns, and stay on the raised track where you can. The marsh looks flat to people who do not know it. It is not flat. It remembers every foot. Clara tucked the deed envelope inside her sweater, under the coat, where rain would not reach it. The keys went into the pocket with the peppermint. The blanket she tied to the duffel strap. At the door, she turned back. The clerk had already resumed writing, but she had not put her glasses on. She sat very still with one hand resting near the brass stamp. Outside, the rain had stopped. The town looked different with papers in Clara's keeping, not kinder exactly, but more legible. Her shoes still leaked. Her stomach still pulled against itself, yet each business she passed seemed to have edges now, names, hinges, windows, small human arrangements. The diner door opened and released a ribbon of coffee smell into the cool air. At the bait shop, a man in rubber boots hung a net to dry. The laundromat dryers kept turning, steady as tide. The pharmacy clerk taped a new postcard display to the glass. Island Hardware and Feed stood with its galvanized tubs shining faintly under a break in the clouds. Clara stopped there because Mrs. Pritchard's map had a small note beside it. Ask about the back track if confused. Inside the hardware store, the air held the clean dryness of seed packets, rope-oiled metal and pine boards. A bell over the door gave one muted ring. Near the entrance stood sacks of oyster shell, chicken feed, peat moss and lime. Along the wall were drawers labelled by screw size, bins of nails sold by the pound, kerosene wicks, lantern mantles, saw files, sash cord, galvanized hinges, mouse traps, bootlaces and bars of yellow soap. A pot-bellied stove sat cold near the back, its pipe rising through a patched ceiling tile. The man behind the counter was broad through the chest, with white sideburns and a left hand missing the tip of its ring finger. He looked up from sharpening a plane iron. You lost. It was not a question. I am looking for cedar hammock. He set the iron down slowly. Most people looking for that are either county men or children daring each other. Yes, sir. Which one are you? Neither, sir. She showed him the map without showing the deed. He studied Mrs. Pritchard's handwriting, then gave a short breath through his nose. Alma sent you the safe way. He took the pencil from behind his ear and added 2 marks. Past the old oyster road, keep left where the shell track splits. Right side looks better. It is worse. You will see a burned cedar stump shaped like a man bending over. After that, count 3 utility poles. The third one has no wire. The footpath starts there. Thank you. Do not cross the black mud. Yes, sir. I mean that. It shines pretty because it wants your shoes. Yes, sir. He glanced at her duffel, the sealed blanket, the shoes, then back to her face. You got water? No, sir. He turned, took a dented metal canteen from a shelf beneath the counter, filled it from a sink in the back, and set it down. Bring it back when you can. I do not know when that will be. Then bring it back when becomes a thing. Clara nodded once. It was the most she could do without losing composure in a public place. She left town after noon. The road out toward the marsh did not announce a beginning. It simply loosened. Houses grew farther apart. Fences gave way to drainage ditches and low stands of loblolly pine. Then came the smell of salt hay, brackish water, and the mineral heaviness of exposed mud. The sky cleared in torn patches, and sunlight moved across the wet fields so slowly it seemed to be choosing where to rest. The raised track began beyond a row of leaning mailboxes. It was packed shell and sand, pale under the boots, edged with cordgrass flattened by winter wind. Clara walked carefully, watching for the left split, the burned cedar stump, the 3 poles. A brown dog came out from under a porch half a mile back and followed her without barking. It was lean, with one ear folded over and a white blaze down its face. When she stopped, it stopped. When she walked, it walked. After a while it grew bored with her poverty and trotted home. There were neighbours, but not near ones. A blue house stood on pilings beyond a ditch, with crab pots stacked beneath it and oyster shells heaped beside the drive. Farther on, a weathered trailer sat behind a windbreak of cedars. Its porch hung with glass floats and faded rope. An elderly man in a knit cap watched her pass from a chair near the door. He lifted 2 fingers from the armrest. Clara lifted her hand back. Neither of them called out. Walnut trees appeared where the ground rose slightly, old enough to have survived storms that had taken lesser things. Their branches were bare and black against the washed sky. Catkins had not yet opened. Beneath them, the track narrowed, and the marsh began to show itself without apology. Water lay everywhere. Not a lake, not a river, but 1,000 small gleams fitted among grass, ditch, channel, and mud. The cordgrass stood winter yellow and silver at the tips. Egrets moved far off like pieces of cloth, lifted and set down by careful hands. A red-winged blackbird called once from a reed clump, though spring had not yet fully claimed the place. Wind ran over the marsh without obstacle, entering sleeves, collar, and bone. At the 3rd pole with no wire, Clara found the footpath. It was barely a path, only a raised rib of shell, mud, and old boards laid end to end where the wet ground required persuasion. Some boards were sound, some gave softly. Some had disappeared, leaving gaps where marsh water showed dark and patient beneath. Clara carried the duffel in both arms now to keep it from pulling her sideways. Twice she stopped to breathe. Once she heard something slip into water nearby and held still until the rings widened and vanished. Then she saw the shack. It stood farther out than she expected, not in town, not beside any lane, but at the edge of a tidal gut where narrow water curved through grass toward the bay. The building rested on cedar pilings crusted with oyster shell and green-black weed. It was roughly 18 feet by 24, low-roofed, 1-story, with a lean-to room added at the back and a short porch that sagged toward the channel. The siding had once been whitewashed cedar shakes, though weather had worn them down to grey, brown, and the colour of bone. The roof was patched in 3 materials: rusted tin, tar paper, and 2 automobile license plates nailed like desperate shingles near the ridge. A brick chimney rose from the left side, crooked but still upright. Its cap had broken away, leaving the top open to rain and nesting birds. A length of stovepipe lay in the grass below, red with rust. One window facing the marsh had lost half its glass and wore feed sacks tacked inside. Another had been covered with plywood that bowed outward like a swollen cheek. Above the door, hanging by one nail, was a sign so weathered it had nearly become wood again. Ward daughter Decoys. The last letters had faded almost past reading. Clara stopped at the end of the path. The marsh made its small sounds around her. Water licking pilings. Grass rubbing grass. A gull crying once. Not near. Somewhere under the porch, a loose board tapped when wind entered and left. She did not cry. There was too much to notice. The door was painted a green, so worn it appeared only in sheltered places near the hinges. The iron key from Mrs. Pritchard's ring fit after some patient coaxing, though the lock resisted as if waking from a long illness. Clara turned it with both hands. Something inside gave, not a click, but a tired internal surrender. The porch boards complained under her weight. She stepped where the joists seemed most likely to be, testing each plank before trusting it. The door opened inward on a smell so dense and layered that she stood in the threshold until her eyes adjusted. Salt first, then cedar, then mildew, gold ash, mouse nests, rust, and the deep, dry sweetness of wood shavings that had been waiting in cracks for decades. The front room was a workroom. Light entered through the broken marsh window and fell in a pale rectangle across the floor. Dust lay everywhere, but not evenly. Wind had arranged it in drifts. A bench stood under the sound wall, thick, scarred, and tilted slightly forward, with a wooden vise whose screw had blackened from hand oil. Shelves rose above it, crowded with jars, tins, blocks, clamps, patterns, cracked mugs, and a row of decoy bodies in different stages of becoming. Some were only rough blanks with squared heads. Some had been sanded smooth. One lay on its side with a painted eye watching the floor. There was a pot-bellied stove near the chimney, black with rust freckles, its door hanging ajar. Beside it stood a dented coal scuttle holding mouse-gnawed kindling and one folded newspaper yellowed to the colour of old teeth. A broom without a handle leaned in the corner. On the far wall hung silhouettes of ducks cut from cardboard, their edges feathered by damp. Every sound Clara made seemed too loud. The floor answered each step differently. Near the threshold it creaked high and sharp. By the bench it gave a lower note. At the centre, one plank dipped. She learned it immediately and stepped around it thereafter. The room was cold enough that her breath showed. When she touched the bench, the wood felt dry beneath the top layer of dust, as if cold had preserved what damp had not claimed. The back room was smaller and darker. It had been used for sleeping, maybe storage, maybe both. A narrow iron cot stood against one wall with no mattress, only rusted springs sagging in the centre. There was a shelf with 2 blue enamel plates, a chipped cup, and a coffee tin half filled with nails. A table no wider than a washboard stood under the back window, which looked toward a stand of cedars bent by wind. On the floor lay a braided rug, so rotted that Clara's toe went through it when she tried to move it. The ceiling had stained brown around 3 leaks. One corner held a collapsed stack of newspapers and what remained of a cardboard box. A raccoon, or something with similar opinions about ownership, had torn through it long ago. Insulation hung from a hole near the lean-to roof like dirty wool. Still, there were walls. There was a door that closed. There was a stove, even if untested. There was a bench where hands had worked before hers. There was a roof that failed in places but had not entirely given up. There was a window, broken but facing water. These were not comforts in the ordinary sense. They were facts. Facts could be leaned against carefully. Clara set the duffel on the backroom table and listened. No voices. No courthouse clock. No bus brakes. No Vernon arranging papers. Only the marsh, the wind, and the slow drip from a roof seam into a rusted pan someone had placed there years before. The drip had made a clean mark inside the pan, round and patient. She opened the emergency blanket and spread it over the iron cot springs, then discovered at once that the springs would not hold her without cutting through. So she moved to the floor beside the interior wall, where the boards seemed strongest. She cleared mouse droppings with a scrap of cardboard, laid down the least rotten newspapers, then the emergency blanket, then her coat. The duffel became a pillow. Before dark, she took inventory of what could be done immediately. The door needed to be wedged because the latch did not trust itself. She used a fallen cedar shim from beneath the bench. The broken window needed covering. She found 2 feed sacks and nailed one loose corner with a rusted tack pressed in by the handle of Elias's knife. The drip pan needed emptying. She carried it outside and poured the brown water off the porch into marsh grass. The cold deepened while she worked. She ate the cheese crackers from Mrs. Pritchard's desk in 6 careful bites and drank from the canteen only after each bite had gone down. Hunger complained because the food woke it. Then it settled again, disappointed but quieter. When full dark came, the shack changed. The marsh disappeared first, then the path, then the walnut trees. The window became black glass where her own pale face appeared and vanished whenever she moved. Without electricity, darkness did not descend all at once. It entered corners, gathered under the bench, filled the stove mouth, climbed the walls, and finally stood close enough to touch. Clara sat on the floor with her back against the boards and the folded knife in her lap. The building spoke in weather. A board knocked near the porch, the roof ticked as temperatures fell. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse chewed with tiny, exact persistence. Wind pressed against the feed sack over the window until it billowed inward, then slackened. The tide turned after midnight. She did not know the hour, only that the sound beneath the pilings changed from outward trickle to inward lift. Water came back under the shack, licking higher, carrying bits of reed against the posts. Cold climbed through the floor. She pulled the emergency blanket over her shoulders, but it crackled whenever she moved, loud as dry leaves. She tucked her hands beneath her arms and tried to make herself compact. The peppermint from the bus driver remained in her pocket. Near midnight, or what felt like midnight, she unwrapped it and placed it on her tongue. It tasted of sugar, dust, and human mercy. She did not pray in words. Words had been used too often around her by people who wanted papers signed, rooms emptied, grief managed, bills explained, and silence mistaken for agreement. Instead, she sat in the dark and held the knife handle until the familiar dents along the wood found her fingers. Then she breathed with the water under the floor, in and out, matching the tide because there was nothing else steady enough. Near dawn, she woke from a sleep so shallow it seemed she had only stepped aside from the room for a moment. Grey light entered around the feed sack. Her mouth tasted of metal. Her legs ached from curling against cold. The first bird she heard was not a duck but a wren somewhere in the leaning porch roof, scolding the morning as if it owned every nail. Clara opened her eyes and saw the workbench across the room, its tools and jars emerging one by one from darkness. She lay still. The room had not rejected her. The roof had leaked, the floor had chilled her, the walls had allowed wind through, but the door remained closed. The tide had not taken the pilings, and the world outside had not required her to move along before sunrise. For the first time in 6 weeks, she had awakened in a place where no one had told her she could not remain. She turned her head toward the broken window. Beyond the feed sack, light gathered over the marsh in a narrow silver band. Grass bowed. Water shone. Somewhere far out, unseen birds called to one another in low, rough notes that sounded older than language and less lonely than speech. Clara sat up slowly, folded the emergency blanket along its factory creases, and placed it beside the duffel. Then she stood in the centre of the workroom and rested one hand on the bench, palm flat, as if greeting a living thing that deserved patience. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. By the 3rd morning, Clara had learned which parts of the floor would tell on her. The plank near the front door gave a bright, complaining cry if she stepped too close to the hinge side. The board before the stove sank a 1/4 inch and answered with a low groan like a man rising from sleep against his will. 2 boards near the workbench were firm, likely fastened over a joist that had stayed honest through damp years. The safest path crossed from the threshold to the bench, turned right at the stove, then followed the wall into the back room. She practiced it until her feet knew what her eyes could not see in darkness. The first 3 days were not brave days. They were exact days. She rose with cold in her wrists, folded the emergency blanket, and checked the tide before stepping onto the porch. She carried the canteen to the nearest public spigot. Mrs. Pritchard had marked near the old oyster road, 1.5 miles each way, because the well behind the shack had been capped with a rusted iron lid, and the rope beside it had rotted into separate strands. The well curb leaned under moss, and when Clara lifted the lid once with both hands, the smell that rose was mineral, dark and uncertain. She lowered it again without testing further. The outhouse stood behind the shack where the ground rose by inches beneath twisted cedars. Its door hung from one hinge. One wall had separated from the frame enough for marsh wind to enter freely. Inside, the seatboard was silvered by age and split along the grain. There were wasp nests under the eaves, empty for the season but shaped like paper hearts gone grey. Clara repaired what she could with no tools beyond the knife, a length of wire found near the porch and 2 nails pulled from a broken crate. Privacy became a feed sack tacked across the widest gap. Water took time. Warmth took more. Cleanliness became a negotiation with weather. Each morning she swept one portion of floor with the handleless broom, working dust toward the door in narrow grey ribbons. Mouse droppings went into a coffee tin, and then outside. Broken glass was lifted one shard at a time, wrapped in newspaper, and set beneath the porch where no foot would find it by accident. She did not disturb the shelves yet. The workroom had kept its own order for so long that she felt any haste would be a kind of trespass. On the first afternoon she found an old galvanized bucket under the lean-to roof, and carried it to the water's edge when the tide had fallen. She used marsh mud to scour rust from the bottom, then sand, then handfuls of dead grass. The bucket would not hold drinking water, but it would hold wash water carried from the spigot. She washed one shirt and one pair of stockings and hung them across the back room on a line made from unravelling a frayed rope. They dried stiff and smelling faintly of salt. At night, she slept in clothing, coat, and emergency blanket, with the duffel beneath her head and Elias's knife inside her sleeve. She did not fear the shack as much as she feared being made to leave it. The building was cold, blunt, unreliable, but it did not ask her to explain herself. By the 4th morning, hunger had sharpened everything. The crackers were gone. The canteen held only a mouthful. Clara walked into town under a high white sky, following the shell track, and then the road, each step making the blister on her heel reopen and close. The island was waking when she arrived. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. A man hosed fish scales from a concrete pad behind the bait shop. The diner windows steamed again with the ordinary wealth of breakfast. She went first to the clerk's office, intending to return the canteen to Mrs. Pritchard and say she was still there, though she did not know why that mattered. But the office was not open yet. The camellia bush beside the brick wall held 3 pink blossoms, each one browned at the edges from cold. Clara stood before the locked door, then turned toward Island Hardware and Feed. The bell gave its muted ring. The man behind the counter looked up from stacking tins of paste wax. In daylight she saw more of him. His name was Everett Bell, according to the stitched patch on his canvas vest. His face had the weathered red-brown cast of men who worked near water and refused hats until too late. His eyebrows were white and unruly. The missing fingertip on his left hand had healed long ago into a smooth, rounded nub. When he reached for a pencil, he used that hand without hesitation, as though loss had become merely one more method. "You brought the canteen," he said. "Yes, sir." She set it on the counter. "You walked from there this morning?" "Yes, sir." Hungry, Clara looked at the rows of nails behind him. "Yes, sir." Everett nodded once, not at her, but at some private arithmetic. The store was deeper than it seemed from the street. Its morning light came through the front windows and weakened halfway down the centre aisle, where shelves rose high with cork. Lamp oil, drain snakes, brushes, hinges, rolls of flashing, coils of rope, stovepipe sections, window glazing, seed corn, boot grease, and cans of marine paint whose labels had faded at the edges. Near the back, a rack held paper patterns for duck blinds, skiff repairs, chicken coops, and one sun-browned booklet titled Home Repairs for Shore Buildings, revised 1978. Everett took the booklet from the rack, blew dust from its top, and placed it on the counter. "Can you read a diagram?" "Yes, sir." "Can you follow directions without improving them?" Clara looked at him. "I can try. That is better than yes." He opened a ledger bound in brown cloth and turned to a blank page near the back. Across the top he wrote Clara Whitaker in block letters. Beneath that he wrote cedar hammock. "I do not have money," she said. I noticed. "I cannot promise when I could pay. I did not ask when. I do not want charity. That is fortunate, because this is credit." She kept her hands at her sides. "You do not know me. I know Alma sent you with my canteen and you brought it back. That is not much. It is the beginning of much." He wrote another line in the ledger, then slid the repair booklet toward her. "The manual is free because nobody has bought one since before you were born. You bring it back when you know what it says." Clara touched the corner of the cover. "Thank you. Mr. Bell? Everett is fine if you're carrying shingles someday. Mr. Bell if I have to read county paperwork." A small sound almost escaped her. Not laughter exactly, but its older cousin. Everett reached behind the counter and began taking items from different shelves with the care of a pharmacist, filling a serious prescription. He did not ask what she wanted first. He seemed to know that people in ruin often did not know the order of saving. £1 8-penny galvanized nails, 69 cents, he said, writing it down. £half-pound 3-penny finish nails, 38. 1 roll tar paper remnant, 9 feet, $1.10. 2 panes salvage glass, small, 75 each. But you are not carrying those today. Box of matches, 12 cents. Bar soap, 9. Tin cup, chipped enamel, 20. Oatmeal, £1. 34. Beans, navy, £1 29. Salt pork end, marked down, 42. Lamp wick, 18. Kerosene, 1 quart, 31. But keep it away from rags, or I will hear about it from the Lord and from Alma. He added each amount slowly. Clara watched the numbers gather like a debt, and felt both dread and warmth. "Can I do work here?" she asked. "Sweeping, stacking, anything." "You can stack seed trays after you eat." "Yes, sir." He placed a brown paper bag on the counter and put the oatmeal, beans, salt pork, matches, soap, and tin cup inside. Then he added a dented spoon without writing it down. "That spoon has offended customers for 8 years," he said. "Take it out of my sight." She looked at the ledger. "You did not write the spoon." "No." "Should I return it?" "Not unless it reforms." This time the small sound did leave her. For 2 hours she stacked seed trays, swept the back aisle, wiped mouse dust from canning jars, and sorted bent nails from a coffee can because Everett said crooked nails still had uses, but only if a person knew where to find them. He gave no praise. He corrected once when she stacked trays too close to the stovepipe. He showed her how to wrap the nail paper so the points did not escape through the bottom. At noon he handed her a heel of bread with a smear of butter and did not watch her eat it. When she returned to the shack that afternoon, the brown bag under one arm and the manual tied to the duffel strap, the place looked less impossible by one narrow degree. The first true repair was not the roof. It was the chimney, because the stove meant heat, and heat meant that one thought could follow another without breaking from cold. The manual warned that chimneys in abandoned shore buildings collected nests, salt crystals, loose brick, soot, and dead things. Clara read the chapter 3 times by window light. Then she tied a feed sack around her hair, wrapped another over her mouth, and took inventory of what could serve as tools. There was no chimney brush. She made one from a cedar sapling cut with Elias's knife, rags tied along its length, and a length of wire twisted through holes punched with a nail. For weight she used a rusted hinge bound near the end. It was crude, but the manual said agitation mattered more than elegance if the flue was straight. The flue was not straight. She began from the top because Everett had warned her not to drive a nest downward into a tighter bend. Reaching the roof required a ladder, and the only ladder on the property lay beneath the shack, half buried in grass, one rung broken, another soft with rot. She tested it across 2 porch blocks first. Then she climbed it 1 rung at a time while wind pushed against her skirt and the marsh widened beneath her feet. The roof surface felt worse than it looked, tin-flexed, tar paper cracked under pressure. The license plates were slick from salt film. Clara moved on hands and knees, keeping weight over the rafters where nail lines showed faintly through rust. At the chimney, she found a nest of twigs, grass, feathers, and blackened newspaper packed beneath the broken cap. She pulled it out in handfuls, placing each handful into a bucket tied to a rope so it would not scatter into the marsh. Then came soot. It rose in dry black breaths. Creosote scaled from the flue walls in shiny flakes like broken beetle shells. Some pieces were hard as coal, some smeared like tar. She lowered the rag brush, twisted, lifted, struck the sides gently, lowered again. The hinge clinked against brick. Twice the brush caught and would not move until she worked it loose inch by inch. Her arms shook by the second hour, her knees ached from the roof. Soot entered the feed sack around her mouth and settled bitter on her tongue. She worked until light began to thin. The next day she cleaned from below. She removed the stovepipe, carried it outside and beat it gently with a stick until soot fell in black crescents onto newspaper. She scraped the interior elbow with a bent spoon handle, then wiped it with dry grass and rags. Inside the stove she found ash packed hard from years of damp. She shoveled it with a tin lid, sifted for nails or embers out of habit learned from Elias, then carried the ash outside in the galvanized bucket. The chimney took 9 hours over 2 days before the draft seemed clear enough to test. Even then, she did not trust it. Everett had said a chimney could look open and still send smoke sideways into a room, and smoke had killed people more gently than fire. So she lit only a twist of newspaper in the stove belly, keeping the door open and her face away. The paper caught, flared and trembled, smoke rose, hesitated at the stove throat, then drew upward into the pipe. Clara held still. A minute passed. Then another. The smoke did not return. She stepped outside and saw it emerge from the crooked chimney in a thin grey line, bending over the marsh before vanishing. It was not much. It was everything that day. The first fire used cedar splinters from under the bench, 2 finger-thick sticks from the fallen porch rail, and 1 piece of salt pork rind held over the flame until it gave up fat into the pan. Clara cooked beans too soon because hunger defeated patience, and they remained a little hard no matter how long she simmered them. The oatmeal tasted faintly of smoke because the pot lid did not fit. The tin cup burned her lip because enamel was missing at the rim. She ate sitting on the floor beside the stove, both hands around the bowl. Heat changed the room slowly. It entered the boards, it lifted smells from the workbench, cedar and oil and dust, long held down by cold. It loosened her shoulders without asking permission. The window feed sack stirred, the stove ticked. Clara ate every bean, every thread of salt pork, every smoky oat clinging to the spoon. Afterward, she washed the pan with sand, hot water, and the smallest shaving of yellow soap. Then she dried it and set it upside down on the stove because Elias had once said water left on metal was an invitation to sorrow. Only when heat had become possible did she begin the workroom inventory. She approached it the way Elias had approached a fresh cedar block, slowly, with listening in her hands. First she cleared the bench surface. Broken reed, curled shavings, dead flies, a mouse nest made from newspaper margin, 3 rusted tacks, a brass screw, 2 fish scales, and a marble no larger than a pea went into separate piles. The shavings she kept in a dry tin for kindling. The tacks she set aside because points could still serve. The mouse nest she carried outside without judgment. On the left side of the bench lay tools. A draw knife with handles split but usable. A spoke shave missing 1 screw. 3 gouges, 2 straight chisels, 1 V-tool with a chipped corner, a cabinet rasp worn smooth at the handle, a half-round file, a brace without bits, a marking gauge, dividers stiff with rust, and a wooden mallet whose head had been repaired with copper wire. Some tools had initials burned or stamped near the handle, some had no mark beyond use. She cleaned each with a dry rag first, then a drop of kerosene where rust held tight. She did not sharpen anything yet. Sharpening was a promise. and she did not make promises before understanding what had been kept. Above the bench were patterns: black duck, pintail, widgeon, brant, canvasback, redhead, ruddy duck, Canada goosehead, 2 sizes. Some patterns were cut from cigar boxes, some from oilcloth, some from thick paper darkened by fingers. Each carried pencil notes in different hands: lower breast, heavy C, hollow body, Ward keel, eyes forward, do not exaggerate bill. The jars came next. Many were ruined. Linseed oil had skinned over into amber rubber. Turpentine had vanished entirely, leaving only a ghost smell when she opened the lid. Pigment jars survived better, burnt umber hard but scrapable. Yellow ochre dry at the edges, lamp black fine and dangerous, red oxide in clumps, white lead sealed under a warning label from another century. Clara set the white lead aside and did not open it. The manual from Everett had not mentioned paint, but common sense and old caution stood near enough. On the second shelf were unfinished birds. 7 bodies, 3 heads, 2 keels, 1 pair of wings carved separately for reasons she did not yet know. A black duck body had been hollowed but not joined. Its seam pins were still stuck in a strip of cloth. A canvasback drake wore primer on one side and bare cedar on the other, as though the maker had set it down between breaths and never returned. 1 tiny teal, hardly larger than Clara's palm, had been painted with such delicate restraint that she placed it in the back room, away from damp air and her own clumsiness. Then the chest. It stood beneath the far end of the bench where the shadow was thickest, a low tool chest made from cedar boards, iron-bound at the corners with a lid warped but closed. A strap hinge had broken on one side, a leather handle had gone stiff and cracked. The lock plate was present, but no lock hung from it. Clara had seen it on the first day and avoided it, partly from caution, partly because certain objects ask to be met when a person is no longer merely surviving. On the 5th day, with the stove drawing clean and a bowl of beans warming near the fire, she pulled the chest into the light. It was heavier than it should have been. At first she assumed damp had swollen the wood or tools remained inside. The lid lifted with a groan from the hinge. Inside were ordinary things, though ordinary in the way a hand-worn life is never plain. 2 awls, a small hammer, a bundle of leather thongs, brass tacks in a spice tin, a paper packet of glass eyes wrapped in cotton, 3 old paintbrushes, their bristles stiffened to useless fans, a coil of fine chain, a broken pocket knife, a cedar disc about 4 inches across, smooth on one side, marked on the other with a carved duck in profile. She removed everything and arranged it on the bench. The chest remained too heavy. Clara frowned, then stopped herself from rushing toward any conclusion. Weight had to be listened to. She pressed one hand against the bottom boards. They did not flex. She tilted the empty chest forward. Something inside shifted with a muffled sound, not a rattle, not the loose scatter of nails, but a thick, settled movement. She set the chest down. Sound test first. She knocked on the left side panel, hollow near the top, dull near the bottom. Right side, the same. Front panel, honest. Back panel, thick. Then the bottom, near the centre. The knock was dead along the edge. It rang lightly. She tapped again, moving by finger widths, and the difference appeared not as a line to the eye, but as a line to the ear. Weight test next. She pushed down on each corner from inside. The rear left corner did not move. The front right gave the faintest whisper. She ran her fingertips along the inside seam and felt dirt, old wax, and then a place where the grain changed too evenly. The false bottom, if there was one, had been made by someone who understood patience. The cedar disc lay on the bench. She picked it up and turned it over. The carved duck on its back was not decoration only. The tail came to a point slightly sharper than the rest. The disc was a tool or a key, or both. Clara searched the chest again and found, hidden beneath a smear of old wax in the right front corner, a round depression no wider than a pencil eraser. She pressed the duck's pointed tail into it. Nothing happened. She tried again, gentler. Still nothing. She breathed once, set the disc down, and warmed the corner with both hands. Wax softened under body heat. Not quickly, but enough. She scraped lightly with the dull side of Elias's knife, clearing old grit. Then she pressed the cedar disc into the depression and turned it clockwise. A wooden pin released inside the bottom with a sound so soft she almost missed it. Not a click. A sigh. The false floor lifted a fraction along the rear seam. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long while. The stove ticked behind her. Outside, wind moved through marsh grass. A gull passed over the roof, its shadow crossing the broken window and disappearing. The chest waited, having waited longer than she had been alive, longer than her mother had been alive, perhaps longer than Elias had carried his own first knife. She used the blade tip only to raise the edge, careful not to scar more than necessary. The false bottom came up slowly, cedar against cedar, held by age and dust. Beneath it lay oilcloth packages arranged with exact deliberation. Not tossed. Not hidden in panic. Kept. The first package was long and narrow, tied with cotton string gone brown. She untied rather than cut it. Inside lay a carving knife with a worn applewood handle, the blade bright beneath a coat of grease that had protected it through years. Burned into the handle was a mark she recognized from the patterns, a duck profile above 3 waves. Beside it lay a small folded paper with 2 words written in iron brown ink. For steadying. The second package held 3 gouges wrapped in waxed cloth, each blade honed and greased, each handle shaped by another hand's labour. The third held blocks of Atlantic white cedar, thin and carefully selected, their grain straight, their scent rising the moment the cloth opened. The fourth contained pigment packets, sealed in paper and labelled with names older than the jars on the shelf: umber, ochre, verdigris, bone black, Venetian red. Tucked beside them was a little glass vial of gold powder so fine that light seemed to enter it and stay. Clara did not touch the powder. The 5th package was heavier. It contained a tin box soldered at the corners, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth and tied with cord. The box had no lock, only a hasp pinned with a small square nail. Her fingers would not work at first. She held them near the stove until they steadied, then pulled the nail free and lifted the lid. Inside were decoys. Not full-sized working birds, but a compact flock of miniature ducks carved from cedar, each hollowed, joined, painted and sealed. There were 12 of them, each no longer than her hand. Black ducks, teal, a pintail, a brant, a ruddy duck with its tail raised like a question, and 1 canvasback drake with a pale back and chestnut head. Their outer paint was plain, weather-coloured, almost severe, but where one had been left slightly open at the seam, Clara saw a gleam inside. Gold leaf. She lifted the nearest bird with both hands. It weighed wrong, too heavy for cedar. The belly had a seam so fine it disappeared until turned toward light. She found the release beneath the keel, pressed where a maker's thumb would naturally rest, and the hollow body opened. Coins lay inside, wrapped in cotton, gold coins, silver coins, paper currency folded into waxed envelopes. Not loose treasure, not theatrical, but a careful reserve placed in the bodies of birds that looked worthless to anyone impatient. Clara closed the decoy and set it down. She did not count immediately. Counting would make the thing louder. Instead, she opened each miniature bird, one by one, and placed its contents on a clean cloth spread across the workbench. Her movements slowed until they were almost formal. From the black duck came gold half-eagles and 2 $10 Liberty heads, each wrapped separately. From the teal came silver dollars, Morgan heads worn soft at the hair, and eagle, dated 1881, 1884, 1896, 1902. From the pintail came paper notes, large-size certificates folded along lines so old they seemed printed into the fibres. From the brant came $5 gold pieces and a small envelope of dimes, Barber dimes mostly, with 1 seated Liberty dime so thin the date barely remained. From the canvas back came 3 St. Gordon's double eagles, their surfaces warm even in grey light. From the ruddy duck came a roll of quarters, a folded bank receipt, and a military medal wrapped in blue cloth. The medal was darkened with age, suspended from a ribbon faded toward brown. On the back, carefully engraved, was a name Clara did not know and the year 1918. She set the medal apart. The paper currency required flat hands. She unfolded each note only enough to identify it, then weighted the corners with pigment jars so it would not curl. Some bills had been issued by banks whose names had vanished. Some were silver certificates. Some were gold certificates in denominations that made her hands go cold for a reason that had nothing to do with weather. Then came the ledger sheet. It had been folded beneath the coins in the last bird, written in a compact hand with columns ruled by pencil. Clara counted against it, because whoever had hidden these things had expected someone careful to come after. The total in currency, coin, and listed deposit certificates came to $50,217.43. She counted twice. The second count differed by 10 cents because she had placed 1 dime with the quarters. She corrected it and began again from the top. Gold, silver, paper, bank receipt, medal. The number remained. She did not understand what it meant in the modern world. She understood only that it was more money than she had ever seen, more than Vernon had spoken of in any room, more than her mother's medicines, more than rent, more than every hour she had stood at sinks and counters and sorting tables. It should have made a noise, it should have altered the weather. It did neither. The marsh went on shining. At the bottom of the tin box, beneath a sheet of wax paper, lay a red booklet bound in worn cloth. It was not large. The corners had softened. A ribbon marker, once redder, lay between pages near the back. Clara lifted it and saw the gold-stamped words on the cover, faint but legible. Conservation deed and marsh title record. Her thumb rested at the edge. She opened only the first page. Names appeared: acreage, survey descriptions, tidal marsh, creek bends, cedar hummocks, rights of access, restrictions against draining, timbering, commercial fill and sale without preservation covenant. The language was dense, legal and careful. The land surrounding the shack had not been forgotten after all. It had been protected in some hidden way by people whose names had been folded into county books and then out of common speech. Clara closed it before the words could outrun her strength. There was also a letter. It lay beneath the red booklet in an envelope sealed with dark wax, addressed not to a name but to a possibility. The writing across the front was clear, slanted, and old-fashioned. To the one who opens this with need and care. Clara held the envelope for a long time. The stove had burned low, the beans in the pot had thickened and begun to stick, light outside had shifted toward evening, and the workroom was turning amber at the broken edges of the window. All the open decoys sat before her like a flock stopped mid-migration. Coins lay in rows. Notes rested beneath jars. The medal waited apart. The red booklet seemed to hold more land than any small cover had a right to contain. She did not open the letter. Some things required mourning, some things required a person to be less hungry, less cold, less newly remade by what a false bottom could keep. She returned the coins to their cotton wrappings, not into the birds yet, but into the tin box. She slid the notes back into their envelopes. She wrapped the medal again in blue cloth and placed it on top. The red booklet and sealed letter she set beside Elias's knife on the bench. Then she stood, because sitting any longer would make her hands shake. Outside the tide had fallen. The marsh stretched under a sky washed clear after days of weather. The channels held strips of copper light. Far out, a line of ducks moved low over the grass, bodies dark against the brightness, wings beating with the old measured effort of living things that knew distance and did not complain of it. Clara stepped off the porch and walked to the edge of the tidal gut. The air smelled of salt, mud, cedar, and smoke from her own chimney. She could see the shack behind her reflected in broken water. Crooked roof. Patched window. Chimney leaning but drawing. Sign over the door just readable from that angle. It looked no richer than it had that morning. It looked, if anything, more fragile under the wide evening. Clara put both hands into her coat pockets. In one pocket was the peppermint wrapper from the bus driver, folded into a tiny square because she had not yet found a place for it. In the other was the key ring from Mrs. Pritchard, gold and solid. She stood there until the copper left the water and the first blue of evening entered the grass. Only then did she go back inside. She did not read the letter that night. She banked the stove with 2 careful sticks, ate the scorched beans without tasting them, and moved the tin box beneath the bench where her feet could touch it from the floor. The sealed envelope remained on the workbench, white in the dimness, waiting with a patience older than sleep. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. Its morning came without ceremony. No trumpet of light entered the room. No sudden warmth moved through the boards. Gray simply gathered behind the feed sack until the workbench appeared, then the stove, then the sealed envelope lying beside the red booklet, as plainly as a loaf on a table. Clara woke before the wren began its quarrel in the porch roof. She had slept with one hand extended toward the tin box under the bench, not touching it, only near enough that her fingers knew it remained. The stove held a little life beneath ash. She fed it slowly, shaving curls from a cedar scrap, and adding 2 twigs only after the first flame had proved itself. Smoke climbed the pipe with the clean draw she had earned from soot and aching shoulders. In the thin warmth she washed her hands in cold water from the canteen, dried them on the least dirty corner of her skirt, and stood before the bench. The envelope had darkened at the edges with age. The wax seal was the colour of dried blood, but smoother, pressed with the same duck and waves mark she had found on the patterns, the cedar disc, and the old knife handles. The handwriting across the front made the room narrow around her. It was not her grandfather's hand, it was older, more slanted, more formal. Yet there was a family likeness in the pressure, in the way each capital letter began with restraint and then opened, as though the writer had been taught that even ink should not waste itself. Clara touched the sealed flap, but did not break it yet. She made oatmeal first, not because she wanted it, but because the body, once neglected too long, must be brought along gently into days that ask more of it. She stirred water, oats, and a shaving of salt pork fat in the little pan until the mixture thickened and steamed. She ate standing up, looking anywhere except at the envelope. The first spoonful tasted of smoke, the second of metal. By the last, she could swallow without effort. Then she cleaned the spoon, set it down, and opened the letter. The wax cracked quietly. Inside was a folded sheet, then another, then 2 more, each written on both sides in brown-black ink. The pages smelled faintly of cedar, iron, and the closed interior of the chest. Clara unfolded them along creases that had held for longer than any house she had ever rented. The first line stood by itself. My dear one, whoever you are, if you're reading this, then you have opened the lower chamber of the tool chest, and you have done it with some patience, because the pin will not release for a careless hand. I'm glad of that. A careless hand would have found only a box, and perhaps a box is all such a person deserves. My name is Miriam Ward Ainsley. I was born on Chincoteague Island in 1879, daughter of Thomas Ward of Cedar Hammock and Eliza Beebe Ward, whose people came down from the New Jersey shore when the oyster beds still fed whole families and the marsh seemed large enough to hold every sorrow. I write this in October of 1944 from a narrow bed in Norfolk, Virginia, where Dr. Samuel K. Blevins of the Marine Hospital has told me that the trouble in my blood will not be turned back by prayer, sassafras, or stubbornness. I have tried all 3 and recommend stubbornness only in moderation. This house began before me. My grandfather, Nathaniel Ward, born 1816 near Snow Hill, Maryland, came to the island after the great September gale of 1846 destroyed his father's skiff and half their roof. He married Ruth Turlington of Accomac in 1841, and built the first part of this shop from salvaged cedar and boat plank in 1849. Their son, Thomas Ward, born 1848, made it into a proper decoy shop after the war years, when market men wanted birds by the dozens and thought speed was the same as skill. Thomas married Eliza in 1872. I was their third child and the only daughter who preferred a gouge to a parlour needle. My brother Joseph carved fast and handsome. My brother Caleb carved deep-bodied brant that rode a chop like living birds. I carved small at first, then clean, then well enough that men who would not buy from a woman bought from Ward and daughter without asking which daughter. That sign above the door was my father's joke and my mother's victory. The trade changed on November 7, 1930, when federal men came through after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act had teeth enough to bite, and market hunting that had fed our shop for 2 generations became a thing men discussed in lower voices. Do not mistake me. The birds needed saving. The marsh needed saving. We had taken too much because hunger wears a respectable coat when enough men put it on. But the day the big orders stopped, this bench went quiet in a way I can still hear. We made decorative birds after that, repairs, a few honest working rigs for lawful seasons and then fewer. By 1933 the storm tide had taken 2 sheds and the road washed out. By 1935 most customers had turned to cheaper things made elsewhere by hands they would never have to look at. There were more losses than trade. My husband, Andrew Ainsley, was taken by influenza after loading freight for soldiers in 1918. My son Thomas Andrew enlisted in the Navy and was lost in the Atlantic in 1942 when his convoy met a German submarine east of Cape Hatteras. My brother Caleb died in France in 1918, near the Meuse Argonne, though the letter took so long reaching us that my mother had already set his place at Christmas. Joseph lived, but silence came over him after that war, and 30 years passed between us with only 2 postcards and 1 returned package of tools. Families can live within shouting distance of love and still fail to cross the room. I leave these things because I could not leave them to the market. Money is a tool, not a throne. Use it to keep a roof above you, to keep hunger from the door, to buy time for your hands to become exact. Do not let it make you loud. Loud people lose the grain. The birds in the tin are not toys, they are records. Open them by pressing beneath the keel where your thumb naturally falls. Return each coin to its bird until need requires otherwise. The Red Book gives the marsh its legal boundary and its burden. It must not be drained, filled, sold for sport camps, or cut apart by men who call ruin improvement. If the covenant still holds, protect it. If it has been forgotten, remember it harder. If you would carve here, begin with cedar dried at least 3 years under air, never kiln heat. Rough the body across the grain only where waste is certain. Hollow the halves to a wall of 3/8 inch, thicker at breast and tail. Join with hide glue warmed no hotter than 140 degrees, clamped overnight, never rushed near stove heat. Prime with thinned oil and ochre, 1 part pigment to 3 parts linseed, and let it stand 2 days in dry weather, longer in marsh damp. Feather work is not decoration. It is breath. For black duck, underpaint with umber and lampblack, then draw warmth through the side with dry ochre before the dark sets. For gold leaf, lay only inside a sealed belly, over red bowl, when the size is tacky enough to whisper against the knuckle but not wet enough to shine. Wait 12 hours before closing. Waiting is half the craft. Inheritance is not what a person receives. It is what a person agrees to carry without being praised for the weight. If you have come here with need, I am sorry for the road that brought you. If you have come with greed, may the roof leak directly above your pillow until you leave wiser. If you have come with care, then take what is useful, mend what is failing, and add 1 honest thing before you go. Behind the shop, past the crooked cedar and the well, you will find a black walnut with a horseshoe grown into its south side. My father nailed it there in 1891 when he said the house needed luck, and my mother said it needed flashing. Beneath that tree is where we stood for family photographs, where Caleb sharpened knives, where my son learned to walk by holding the bark. If the tree lives, greet it for me. I have spent 30 years saying less than I ought and keeping more than I needed. This is my attempt at better order. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Miriam Ward Ainsley, Cedar Hammock, Chincoteague Marsh, October 18th, 1944. Clara read the last line and did not move. The stove made one small settling sound. Light from the broken window lay across the bench and touched the opened pages, making the ink appear wet in places though it had dried before her mother was born. She lowered herself onto the stool because her knees had begun to tremble, not violently, only with the quiet failure of a body asked to stand through too much meaning at once. She read the letter a second time. This time she stopped where the writer named the father, the mother, the brothers, the son. She stopped where the trade fell silent. She stopped where the instructions became so exact that the room seemed to fill with hands, mixing, clamping, hollowing, waiting. She placed her own palm on the bench and noticed the scars in the wood with new attention. A gouge had slipped there. A clamp had bitten there. Someone had set down a hot pan near the rear edge and left a half-moon burn. None of the marks were accidental now. They were sentences in a language she had been taught but not yet trusted to speak. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, not new creases, not easier ones. The paper accepted the old lines and settled into itself. She slid the letter back into the envelope without sealing it, then placed it on top of the red booklet. Her hands moved carefully, almost ceremonially, because haste would have been indecent. Outside, the day had brightened. Clara wrapped the thrift coat around herself and went out through the back door. The back step had split down the centre, so she put her weight on the left side and held the jamb. Behind the shack, the ground rose only a little, but that little made a different world. Marsh grass gave way to a patch of high soil covered in pine needles, cedar cones, oyster shell, and last year's walnut husks blackened by weather. The capped well stood where she had left it, moss dark around the iron lid. Beyond it, 3 cedars leaned east, shaped by storms and salt. The middle one was crooked enough to be the tree from the letter, or so she first believed. Then she saw the walnut. It had been hidden behind the cedars until she came farther around. The trunk was broad, ridged and furrowed, with one low branch reaching toward the shack like an arm that had forgotten to drop. On its south side, partly swallowed by bark, was a horseshoe, not hanging, not nailed freshly, grown in. The iron curved out of the wood in a dark crescent, its nail heads buried so deeply the tree had made lips around them. Clara stood before it with both hands hanging at her sides. The horseshoe was real. The letter had not been a parlour story. The woman in Norfolk had named this tree while ill and far from the marsh, and the tree had remained through hurricanes, winters, salt wind, termites, abandonment, county notices, and years when no one came to greet it. Clara reached out and touched the iron. It was cold. The bark around it was warmer from the morning sun, rough beneath her fingertips, alive in its own slow labour. She looked down at the ground beneath the tree. Fallen walnuts lay split and hollowed by squirrels. A rusted hinge rested half buried in the soil. Near a root was a white shard of china, blue at one edge, perhaps from a cup, broken before any living neighbour remembered the sound. She did not dig. The letter had not told her to dig. It had told her to greet. So she laid her palm against the trunk and stood there until the wind moved through the bare branches and several drops of last night's rain fell from high twigs onto her sleeves. She accepted that as answer enough. When she returned inside, she found the old candle on the second shelf above the bench. She had seen it during inventory and set it aside as useless. It was thick beeswax perhaps, though darkened toward brown, wrapped in paper that had gone brittle and tied with thread. A penciled note on the paper read Christmas 1884, Bayberry and Combe. The wick was buried but still present, a black thread visible at the top. It had no practical value compared with matches, kindling, food, roof tar, nails. It was not something to spend on necessity. That was why she chose it. The stove was warm enough to soften the base. Clara found a chipped saucer in the back room, scraped mouse dust from it, washed it twice, then pressed the candle upright in its centre. The wax gave off a faint scent even before flame, green and honeyed, with something resinous underneath. She set the saucer on the workbench, near the letter but not too near. Then she struck one of Everett's matches. The match head flared sulphur blue, then yellow. She held it to the wick. For a second nothing happened. Then the wick took, bent, and lifted a flame no wider than a fingernail. The candle burned unevenly at first, as if remembering. A bead of wax formed along one side and moved slowly downward. The scent opened into the room, bayberry, old comb, warm dust, cedar, smoke. Clara watched the flame until her eyes watered from not blinking. It was the first deliberate light she had made there that was not for cooking, not for survival, not for seeing where to place her foot. Kept light. She sat beside it and began to understand, not all at once, but in the slow way warmth enters a wall. A bus driver had given crackers and a peppermint. A librarian had copied a number without asking for a confession. A county clerk had placed an emergency blanket on a counter and pretended it was from a desk, not from pity. A hardware man had opened a ledger and called trust by the quieter name of credit. The auto shop owner outside Pocomoke had turned his back so she could leave unshamed. The security guard in Salisbury had stretched a rule by 3 hours because rain was hard on young bones. None of those kindnesses had changed her life by themselves. Each had been small enough to disappear if measured by money, small enough to be denied by the giver if praised too directly. Yet together they had made a footbridge across days when she could not see the far bank. She had crossed by crackers, pencil marks, a canteen, a blanket, a heel of bread, and the mercy of people who did not require her to perform gratitude for them. Perhaps inheritance moved that way too, not as a grand door swinging open, but as plank after plank laid over mud by hands long gone. And maybe you know something about that. Maybe someone once paid for your coffee when your card failed, or opened a door when your hands were full, or sat beside you in a hospital corridor without trying to fix what could not be fixed. Maybe someone gave you a ride, a coat, a room, a sentence you carried for years, if they did. And if you can bear to share it, write it in the comments. Not because every kindness needs an audience, but because some weary person reading late tonight may need to be reminded that the world has not gone entirely hard. Tell us the small things someone did for you, the kind nobody else remembers. Small mercies have long roots. The candle burned lower. Clara did not open the red booklet again that afternoon. She did not count anything. She did not lift the decoys or test the old tools. Understanding had filled the room more densely than work could. Her mind kept returning to the letter's plain instructions, to glue warmed beneath a careful temperature, to walls hollowed 3/8 thick, to paint mixed with ratios exact enough to survive the writer. There was comfort in measurements. There was mercy in a task that did not ask who had abandoned whom. Before dusk, she made the room ready as if receiving company. She cleared one shelf completely, wiped it with a damp rag, dried it near the stove, and laid the letter there with the red booklet beneath it. The miniature birds she returned to the tin box, each wrapped and seated in the same order she had found them. The coins went back inside their bodies, except the military medal, which she held once more in its blue cloth before placing it at the front of the shelf. She did not know the name engraved on it yet, not fully. She would learn it when she had strength for names. She moved the heirloom knife from the first oilcloth package beside Elias's knife. The two blades lay parallel on the bench. Thrown from Their handles were different woods, different hands, different years, but both had been worn by work rather than display. She touched neither after placing them. Some arrangements ask not to be disturbed. For supper she cooked oatmeal again, this time with a smaller piece of salt pork and more patience. She let the water simmer before adding oats, stirred in slow circles, and held the pan above the stove when the heat grew too strong. The result was softer, not good exactly, but less severe. She ate from the chipped enamel cup because the bowl was still drying on the stove. Outside, evening entered the marsh with a blue stillness. The channels darkened first, then the grass, then the cedars behind the well. The walnut remained visible longest, its trunk holding the last grey light, the horseshoe hidden now but known. Clara went out once more before closing the door for the night. She checked the porch wedge, the feed sack over the window, the pan beneath the drip. She looked toward the footpath and saw nothing moving. Inside, she set the bayberry candle on the floor near her sleeping place and let it burn another few minutes while she arranged the night. The emergency blanket went down first, then the thrift coat folded double beneath her shoulder blades, then the duffel for her head. She placed the red booklet, the letter, the 2 knives, and the medal wrapped in blue cloth beside her, not under the bench, not hidden, but within reach. Not because she feared they would vanish, because for one night she wanted the proof near her body that the world had not only taken, it had also kept. The candle flame shortened. Wax gathered in the saucer. The room smelled of bayberry, stove ash, and cedar warmed from within. Clara lay on her side facing the workbench, her hands tucked beneath her cheek, and watched the old tools become shapes in low light. The false bottom stood open on the chest, no longer hiding, no longer needing to. Beyond the broken window, tide water moved under the shack, with the steady patience of something that had never been in a hurry. Before sleep took her, Clara reached out and touched the folded edge of the letter, not to read it again, only to know where it was. The first snow arrived on December 4th, not as a storm with drama, but as a patient whitening that began before daylight and kept going until 5 inches lay over the marsh. Clara woke to a room made strangely bright by the snow outside the broken glass. The feed sack over the window glowed with a soft, milky light, and the usual sounds of water and reed had been muffled into something almost private. Even the shack seemed to hold its breath. The drip pan beneath the ceiling seam had frozen at the edges, making a thin, clear rim that caught the stove light. She did not admire the snow for long. Snow was beautiful only after the roof had done its duty, and this roof had never learned duty well. Meltwater would find every tear in the tar paper, every gap beneath tin, every nail hole widened by rust. By afternoon she had moved the tools, letter, red booklet and tin box away from the worst leaks and placed every pan, cup, tin lid, broken jar, and salvage bowl beneath the ceiling's weak places. The room sounded like a slow clock made of water. That night she read the roofing chapter in Everett's repair manual 3 times. The first reading gave her fear. The second gave her order. The third gave her numbers. The shack measured 18 feet across and 24 feet long, but the roof carried a shallow pitch and an uneven lean-to seam that had to be counted separately. She sketched the plan on the back of an old county notice with the pencil stub from Mrs. Pritchard, marking rafters, patched tin, missing shingles, and the place where the chimney flashing had pulled away like a loose cuff. She calculated square footage twice and then a third time because mistakes on a roof invited rain for years. At Island Hardware and Feed, Everett listened while she explained what she thought she needed. "Say it again from the beginning," he said. So she did. 2 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles from a discontinued brown lot, 1 roll of 15-pound roofing felt, though only half would be used, 6 pounds of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails, 1 bundle of cedar shims, a small tin of roof cement, 8 feet of aluminum flashing, 2 sister rafters, 2x6, each 10 feet, because the south slope had bowed near the chimney, chalk line, utility blades, tar brush, a short pry bar. Everett wrote it all in the ledger, his pencil moving without hurry. "You forgot cap shingles." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Yes, sir. And you cannot roof alone." "I have to." "No. You can begin alone." "That is different." From a shelf behind the counter, he brought down an old roofing hatchet. Its handle was dark hickory, polished almost black where a hand had held it for decades. One side had a hammer head, the other a small blade. The gauge notch along the head was worn but visible. "This belonged to your people," he said. Clara looked at him. "Not by blood, maybe. By trade. A Ward man left it here in 1962 to be rehung. Never came back. My father kept it under the counter because some tools are not ours just because nobody claims them. He set it down between them. I cannot take that. You can sign for it in the ledger. That is not the same as paying." "No, it is better. It means you intend to become the sort of person who returns what should be returned." The next morning, Everett sent a man named Tom Berridge with the lumber delivery. Tom was 71, short, square, and bow-legged from a lifetime on roofs and boats. His beard grew in white patches along his jaw, and his left eye watered constantly in the wind. He had worked on church roofs, oyster shacks, chicken houses, porch additions, and one steeple he refused to discuss, except to say the Lord had poor ladder sense. He wore a canvas coat, rubber boots, and a knitted cap pulled so low it seemed to contain most of his opinions. "I do not take pay from girls with condemned roofs," he said. Clara stood beside the stacked shingles, embarrassed by the directness of his charity. "I can feed you beans. I have survived worse offers." He looked up at the roof and spat into the snow. "That ridge is tired." "Yes, sir." "Chimney side is worse." "Yes, sir." "You scared?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Scared people step better. They worked 11 days. Not all full days. Because December light was brief and wind decided when ladders became foolish. Tom taught without softening. He spoke in short pieces, each one a nail-driven square. Foot there, not there. That nail's proud. Pull it. Again. Watch the line. Feel the rafter. He made her sister the weak rafters first. The sagging boards inside the roof had not broken, but they had bowed enough to change the roof plane. Tom showed her how to cut the 2x6 sisters to length, hold them tight against the old rafters, and fasten them with staggered 3-inch structural screws from Everett's small lock drawer. She had expected nails. Tom shook his head. Nails argue. Screws remember. They lifted each sister rafter into place from inside the workroom, shoulders against wood, breath showing in the cold air. Clara held while Tom started the screws. Then he made her finish them, turning until the new lumber drew itself firm against the old. Her arms shook. Sawdust fell into her sleeves. Once a screw stripped, and Tom made her back it out by hand rather than curse at it. On the roof, he snapped the chalk line. Blue powder marked straightness over a surface that had not been straight for years. Clara watched the line appear and understood why he had insisted on it. The eye forgave too much. A string did not. They tore off tar paper in strips, saving any boards beneath that remained sound. They pulled rusted nails with the pry bar, hammered down what could not be pulled, and cut away rotten sheathing near the chimney. Clara learned to place roofing felt from the bottom upward, each course overlapping by 3 inches, never trusting a seam that faced the weather. She learned the 3-stroke nail: set, drive, kiss. First stroke to place, second to seat, third to make the head flush without bruising the shingle. That nail's proud. Pull it. She pulled it. By the 7th day, her hands had split at 2 knuckles. By the 9th, she could carry shingles up the ladder without looking down. By the 10th, Tom allowed her to run a course alone while he sat on the ridge and watched with the severe peace of an old crow. The marsh below lay pale and cold snow, withdrawn into shaded ditches, water shining through yellow grass. Smoke from the chimney bent low across the roof and then lifted. The flashing took the longest. Tom made her cut aluminum to fit the chimney step by step, each piece tucked beneath shingle and against brick, so water would be led away rather than merely asked. Roof cement went only where needed. Too much made a lie, he said, and lies cracked in summer. At the ridge, they bent cap shingles over the peak and nailed them clean, keeping the final line straight enough that even Tom stood back without criticism. They finished on December 15th. Snow clouds gathered again west of the marsh, but the roof lay whole above the shack, dark, modest, and tightly fastened. Clara stood in the workroom that night with every pan removed from the floor. The silence was unfamiliar. No drip counted the seconds. No cold bead fell onto the bench. The stove burned low, and the roof held. Tom accepted beans after all. He ate from the chipped enamel cup with a spoon that had never reformed and said nothing until he had finished. Then he set the cup down, wiped his beard with a red handkerchief, and looked toward the ceiling. Good enough to learn under, he said. For Tom, that was a blessing. By January, the roof had stopped the water from entering, which meant Clara could finally see what water had already done. The chimney was worse than it had seemed in December. From the outside it had looked crooked but serviceable, a brick stack with a broken crown and stubborn posture. Up close under winter sun, it revealed itself as a patient failure. The upper courses had spalling bricks, their faces flaked away by freeze, thaw, salt and time. Mortar had powdered to grey sand in the joints. When Clara pressed one seam with the handle of a chisel, it crumbled under light pressure and fell in a soft line onto the roof. Tom had warned her before leaving. Roof keeps weather off. Chimney keeps fire honest. Do not trust one just because the other is done. Everett examined the brick dust she brought in a paper packet. Needs repointing. Maybe partial rebuild above the roofline, he said. You are not using Portland straight. Too hard. It will break the brick that survived. He gave her the mix in writing because ratios mattered. 2 parts washed sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fire clay for the hotter joints near the flue. Water added slowly until the mortar held on a trowel without slumping. For exterior joints above the roof. Less water for firebox patching, more patience, not more water. Mist old brick first. Pack deep. Strike joints before surface skins. Protect from hard freeze. The words sounded like instructions for living. The hydraulic lime came in a torn bag from the back room of the hardware store, sold by weight because she could not carry much. Fire clay came in a coffee can with masking tape across the lid. Everett lent her a pointing trowel, a joint raker, and a stiff masonry brush, all written in the ledger with no price yet beside them. He also gave her 2 burlap sacks. Wet them and cover fresh work at night. Not soaked. Damp. Mortar cures. It does not dry like laundry. She began on January 5th. The temperature stayed in the 20s most mornings, rising only briefly above freezing afternoon if sun reached the brick. Clara learned to plan her work around the small mercy of daylight. In the morning she carried warm water from the stove in the tin cup, climbed carefully to the roof, and brushed frost from the chimney. She raked old mortar from the joints by hand, never more than she could repoint before cold returned. The powdered mortar fell into a pan, and then into a sack. She saved sound brick dust because Tom had said old buildings liked familiar material mixed into patches. Her bare fingers went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves protected skin but ruined touch. Mortar work required knowing when a joint was clean, when old brick would tolerate pressure, when a crumbly face should be left undisturbed. She worked gloved until the tool needed guiding, then stripped one glove, packed mortar, struck the seam and shoved her hand under her opposite arm until feeling came back in needles. The first day she cried from pain without making a sound, because tears in cold air are only another liquid to manage. Each joint took longer than she expected. She misted the brick with a rag dipped in warm water. She pressed mortar deep with the edge of the pointing trowel, forcing it into the cleaned joint until it resisted. She struck horizontal lines with a rounded jointer and verticals with a narrower tool Everett had found in a coffee tin. She brushed lightly when the mortar had stiffened enough to take texture. At night she covered the work with damp burlap and tied it with twine against wind. For 3 weeks, the chimney taught her humility in inches. The firebox needed patching too. Inside the shack, she lay on her side before the stove opening, with her cheek near cold brick, scraping loose mortar from the throat and replacing it in narrow bands. Soot blackened her hairline, lime dried her fingertips until they cracked white. When she washed her hands, the water turned grey and slick. On the coldest day, January 18th, the morning temperature read 22 degrees on the hardware store thermometer. Everett told her not to work. She bought beans on credit, carried lime anyway, and returned to the shack with her breath smoking before her. She did not climb the roof that day. She repaired the lower firebox, working in intervals, warming the mortar pan near the stove without letting it dry, holding each tool handle under her arm before using it. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. Late January brought one clear afternoon with pale sun and no wind. Clara had finished the last exterior joint the day before and kept it covered overnight. She removed the burlap carefully. The mortar had set firm, its colour slightly lighter than the old joints, but not rude against them. The chimney still leaned. Its history had not been erased, but it stood with a new integrity, and the broken crown had been patched into a sloped cap that would shed water instead of inviting it. She waited until evening for the test fire, not because she needed to wait that long, perhaps, but because fear needed daylight to leave the room. She opened the stove door, laid cedar shavings, 2 sticks, and 1 dry split from the porch rail Tom had helped cut. The match caught. Flame moved. Smoke rose through the pipe. She went outside and stood in the cold. For 1 breath, nothing showed. Then a thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, not sideways through failed joints, not coughing back beneath the cap, but clean and vertical before the wind took it east over the marsh. It carried the smell of cedar and iron, faint but unmistakable. Clara stood with her arms folded against herself until the smoke thickened. The chimney drew clean. Inside, the stove burned with a steady sound, not loud, not greedy. Heat entered the room and stayed. Clara sat on the floor with her back to the bench and held her hands toward the stove, palms open, fingers spread. There was still hunger, debt, broken glass, poor sleep, and months of labor ahead. But that night the fire belonged inside the house, and the smoke belonged outside it. That was a kind of order. After the roof and chimney, the floors asked to be seen. They had carried everything without complaint. Clara's first cold sleep, the hidden chest, Tom's boots, soot buckets, mortar pans, melted snow, mice, ash, cedar shavings, and 70 years of weather entering where it pleased. Most boards were white pine, wide and uneven, hand-laid with rose-head nails that had darkened into small square shadows. Some planks had been replaced in later years with narrower stock, but much of the front room remained original enough to deserve restraint. Everett rented her the Random Orbits sander for $14 a day and made her sign beside the price. "Do not gouge the floor," he said. "I will try not to. Try with both hands." "Yes, sir." He gave her sanding discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, and 220. The 80 would remove raised grain, old grime, and shallow staining. The 120 would calm what the first pass The 220 would finish the surface enough for oil, though not so smooth that it lost its grip on history. He also sold her a paper dust mask that pinched the bridge of her nose and made every breath taste of paper. Before sanding, she set every nail. That took a day by itself. She crawled over the floor with a nail set and Tom's roofing hatchet, tapping each proud rosehead just below the surface without flattening its old shape. Some nails refused, some bent. One broke and had to be pulled with slow pressure so the surrounding wood did not splinter. She marked weak boards with chalk and avoided sanding them too hard. The first pass with 80 grit filled the room with a storm of pine dust. The machine pulled at her arms as if it had its own preference about direction. Clara moved slowly, always with the boards, never lingering in one place. Old grey lifted under the sanding disc, and beneath it came colour she had not expected. Dark honey in some places, amber near the stove, streaks of reddish-brown where old oil, smoke, and time had settled deep. She stopped often to sweep dust into piles and carry it outside before it entered the stove or her lungs. By evening her shoulders burned. The floor looked worse before it looked better. Sanded paths cut through grime like pale roads, while untouched edges remained dark. The room seemed wounded, half revealed and half ashamed. Clara stood in the doorway and felt a thin discouragement enter her. Not dramatic, only persistent. The kind that sits down and plans to remain. The second pass was kinder. With 120 grit, the harsh scratches softened. The boards began to show their grain again, long lines flowing around knots, nail heads, stains that would not be erased and should not be. Clara learned to let some marks stay, a dark burn near the stove, a crescent scar where a chair or stool had turned for years, a line of deeper wear before the workbench where bodies had stood leaning into tasks. Removing those would have made the floor younger but less honest. The third pass, 220, was almost quiet by comparison. The sander hummed rather than fought. Clara moved through the room in patient lanes until the surface under her palm felt smooth but not slick. Dust coated her lashes, hair, sleeves, and the inside bend of her elbows. When she removed the mask, her face showed pale around the mouth and darker elsewhere, like a photograph developing unevenly. Oil came next. Everett recommended tung oil for water resistance and linseed for warmth, but pure tung was dear. They settled on a blend, 2 parts tung oil, 1 part boiled linseed oil, thinned lightly for the first coat so it would enter the wood. Clara warmed the oil can in a pan of water near the stove, never over flame, then applied it with a folded cotton rag in long strokes along the grain. She worked it in until the boards drank, then wiped away every excess shine, because Everett had warned that puddled oil turned tacky and resentful. The first coat changed the floor from pale sanded pine to dark honey. The second, after a 48-hour cure, deepened it toward amber and chestnut. The third coat, laid thinner and buffed by hand, brought out mahogany shadows along the old nail lines and near the bench, where years of work had compressed the grain. Clara knelt in the room after finishing and saw the stove light travel across the boards in a low, warm sheen. It did not look polished. It looked fed, but there was one bad morning before the third coat. She woke and could not rise properly. Nothing had happened in the night, no leak had returned, no animal had entered, no letter had gone missing. The firebox held coals, the roof held, the chimney drew, yet her body seemed to have reached the end of some hidden store. Her hands lay on the blanket with no wish to become useful. The thought of sanding edges, straining oil, washing rags, and keeping account of every flame-safe cloth made a heaviness settle behind her ribs. She sat up anyway, because survival had made obedience to work feel moral. Then she stopped. Outside dawn was low and colourless. The marsh carried a glaze of ice in the shallow cuts. Clara put on her coat, took the canteen and walked not toward town, not toward the spigot, but to the water's edge beyond the walnut. A great blue heron stood in the tidal gut, one leg lifted, neck folded into itself. The whole bird composed like a question waiting for no answer. Its feathers were the colours of weathered pewter, storm cloud and old slate. It did not fish. It did not startle. It stood. Clara sat on a cold piece of driftwood and watched it. For an hour, maybe more, neither of them did anything worth reporting. The heron shifted once. Clara drank one mouthful of water. The creek moved beneath thin ice with a sound like paper being handled in another room. Her hands rested empty in her lap. That day she did not work. She did not earn rest, justify it, or turn it into a useful lesson. She only remained by the marsh until the heron unfolded itself, opened wings wider than seemed possible from such stillness, and lifted over the grass with slow, deliberate strokes. After it vanished, Clara returned to the shack, added wood to the stove, ate oatmeal, and slept through the afternoon with the floor unfinished beside her. The next morning, she completed the third coat. No one scolded the lost day. Nothing collapsed because she had stopped. The floor waited, then received her again. By February, light became the next repair. There were 8 windows in the shack if the small lean-to opening was counted, and Clara counted it because wind did. 3 had no glass at all, only feed sacks, plywood scraps, or air. 4 were cracked in patterns that looked almost intentional until a cold draught found each line. 1 narrow and wavy, facing the walnut tree, was original to the earliest part of the shop. Tom believed it might date to 1788, salvaged from some older island house or ship captain's parlour, and set into the wall when glass was too dear to waste. Its surface bent the world slightly, making branches curve and light ripple. "That one stays," Tom said when he came by with a sack of kindling. "The frame is soft, then mend the frame. The glass rattles, then make it stop. I should not replace it." Tom looked at her as if she had suggested burning a Bible for warmth. No, so she did not. Everett sold her glazing points, a half-used can of DAP 33 glazing putty, cotton sash cord, a putty knife, and salvage panes cut from storm windows that had come off a motel renovation near the causeway. The glass was not perfect. Some panes had scratches. One had a faint manufacturer's mark in the corner. They were sound, and sound was wealth enough. He taught her the window work on a loose sash across the hardware counter. "First, bed of putty," he said, pressing a thin rope into the rabbit. "Glass rests into it. Not on bare wood. Bare wood breaks glass when weather argues." He set the pane gently. "Points every 8 inches or so. Push flat. Do not hammer unless you enjoy buying more glass." Then he rolled a longer rope of putty between his palms, laid it along the edge, and drew the putty knife in one steady angle, leaving a clean bevel that would shed water. 45 degrees, he said. Corners clean. Paint overlaps glass by a hair when cured. That seals it. How long to cure? Longer than patience, shorter than regret. Skin in a week if weather favours. Paint when it stops taking your fingerprint. The sash cords were their own lesson. The two front windows had counterweights hidden inside the jambs, though one cord had snapped and the other had been replaced with clothesline that had swollen into uselessness. Everett sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord because synthetic line, he said, made old windows feel embarrassed. Tom showed her how to remove the stop moulding without splitting it, open the weight pocket, tie a figure-8 knot at the counterweight, and feed the cord over the pulley until the sash lifted without protest. Do not lose the weight in the wall, he said. What happens if I do? You learn new sorrow. The first window took nearly a full day. Clara removed broken glass with gloves made stiff by cold, pulling each shard from hardened putty and laying it into a pail. She scraped the rabbit clean, sanded loose paint, brushed on a thin coat of oil where bare wood appeared, and waited near the stove while it soaked. She warmed the DAP 33 can in a pan of water until the putty softened enough to knead. The first bevel she made looked lumpy and uncertain. She scraped it off and began again. By the third window, her hand had learned the angle. By the fifth, she could press glazing points without flinching. The sixth window faced the marsh and needed 2 panes. Wind came through while she worked, carrying the smell of salt mud and distant smoke. She had to tack a cloth inside to keep dust from blowing into the fresh putty. The 7th was in the lean-to, small and mean, its frame twisted by roof failure. She planed one side carefully with the old spokeshave after sharpening it for the first time on a stone. Everett lent her. Cedar shavings fell in thin curls, and the frame accepted the pain at last. The original window she saved for a clear day. It faced the walnut, and its glass had survived so much that Clara felt clumsy merely standing before it with tools. The sash was narrow, the muntins delicate, the putty fossil hard. She worked with the patience of a person cleaning around a sleeping bird. She did not remove the glass. She picked away failed putty in small sections, leaving any old bedding that still held. She brushed linseed oil onto bare wood with a child's paintbrush found in a drawer. Then she pressed fresh putty around the pane without forcing it, sealing only what time had opened. The wavy glass rattled less when she finished. Not silent. Only less afraid of wind. On the last window, late in February, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside while Clara was drawing the final bevel. The bird was small, round, and outrageously complete against the grey day. Black cap, white cheek, quick feet gripping bark. It cocked its head and watched her through the newly set pane, as if inspecting the work for the county. Clara held still with the putty knife in her hand. The chickadee tapped once at the branch, fluffed itself against the cold, and gave a small 2-note call. Not song exactly. More like a remark. I know, Clara said softly. The bird flew. She finished the bevel in one clean pull, wiped the putty knife on a rag, and stepped back. 8 windows held light now. Some glass was salvage, some frames bore patches. The old pane bent the walnut into a gentle wavering shape. The room no longer felt sealed by neglect or opened helplessly to weather. It had begun to choose what entered. That evening Clara sat on the restored floor with her back against the workbench and watched late light move through every window the shack possessed. The marsh window gave silver, the side window gave smoke blue, the walnut window gave a darker light, filtered through branches and the iron curve hidden in bark. Nothing in the room was finished in the way magazines meant finished. Nail heads showed putty waited for paint. The roof edge still needed trimming. The chimney leaned. The stove smoked faintly when wind came hard from the east, but the rain stayed out. The smoke went up. The floor held, and light came through glass. Late February exposed the walls. Once the windows held and the stove kept heat without filling the room with smoke, Clara could see where the plaster had failed in earnest. The worst patches lay near the chimney, where years of leaks had softened the wall until the surface bulged in shallow blisters. When she pressed one with 2 fingers, a crescent of plaster broke loose and fell into her palm, light as stale bread, grey-white on the surface and brown beneath. Behind it, hand-split oak lath showed through, thin strips nailed unevenly but firmly, each one bearing ridges where a hatchet had made it ready to hold mortar. Horsehair ran through the broken plaster in dark threads. Everett looked at the sample she carried into the store in a folded scrap of newspaper. "Original," he said. "Yes, sir." "Do not patch it with wallboard mud." "No, sir." He went into the back and returned with a paper sack so aged the corners had been taped twice. Across the front, in faded blue lettering, it named a lime plaster supplier that had closed before Clara was born. The sack held clean horsehair, bundled and tied with cotton string. "My father bought it in the 50s, Everett said. Kept saying someone would need it, right? Took 70 years, but he was not wrong. The mix was slower than anything she had done. Lime putty, sand, horsehair cut into short lengths, and enough water to make it workable without making it weak. Everett lent her a hawk and trowel, though the hawk handle wobbled and the trowel had a corner rounded from use. The 3 failed patches were not large by measurement, but they sat in places where sloppy work would be visible every morning. Clara cut the loose plaster back to firm edges with the knife, brushed dust from the lath, and misted the wood until it darkened. The first coat was the scratch coat. She pressed the plaster through the lath keys, forcing it in until it mushroomed behind the strips and held. Then she laid a rough layer across the face, not smooth, never smooth at first. While it was still soft, she scored it with a comb made from 3 nails driven through a cedar scrap, crossing lines lightly so the next coat would have something to grip. It looked crude. It was meant to. Strong beginnings did not always look finished. The scratch coat cured under damp cloth for days. The brown coat came next, 3/8 of an inch thick, measured not by Hope but by a narrow notched stick Tom had cut and left near the bench. Clara worked from bottom to top, pressing, levelling, shaving away what stood proud. The wool drank moisture unevenly. Near the chimney it tightened faster. Along the outer edge it stayed soft. She covered each patch and waited 72 hours, checking with her fingertip, learning the difference between dry surface and deeper cure. The finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch. It required the most restraint. Too much pressure dragged the underlayer, too much water made shine, too little left ridges that hardened into accusations. Clara held the trowel low and moved in long, deliberate passes, feathering each edge into the original wall. She did not hide the boundary entirely. A repaired wall need not pretend it had never failed. When the final patch had set enough to hold its shape, she stood before it with lime dust on her skirt and hair falling loose around her face. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said it under her breath, not as pride, but as an agreement with the room. Doris began leaving paper bags on the porch in March. At first Clara thought the wind had carried them there, though wind did not usually fold the top of a grocery sack twice and tuck it beneath a stone. The first bag held 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of stewed tomatoes, and 3 heel slices of ham gone too dry for diner plates but not too dry for beans. The second held coffee grounds tied in a filter, 2 apples with bruises cut away, and a note written on an order ticket from Heron's Wake Diner. "Pay in candles when the shop reopens." The handwriting was broad and impatient. Clara knew at once it belonged to the diner woman who wiped the counter in slow circles each morning, though they had spoken only twice. Her name was Doris Vale. She was in her late 50s with iron-grey hair worn in a net, forearms strong from trays and cast-iron pans, and eyes that had learned to measure hunger before a customer said anything. She wore white shoes that squeaked on tile and kept a pencil behind her ear, even when she was not working. Clara carried the empty jars back to the diner one afternoon and tried to pay with $3 from the sale of scrap metal Tom had helped her load. Doris refused to touch the bills. "In candles," she said. "I do not make candles. You lit one, did you not?" Clara looked up. The diner was between breakfast and supper. quiet except for the refrigerator motor and the soft clink of dishes in the back. Doris leaned on the counter as if she had known about the bayberry candle by ordinary island weather. Be smoke direction. Buy the kind of gossip that travels without malice. One candle is not a shop. One biscuit is not a banquet. But you ate it. Clara folded the money again. I do not want to owe everyone. Doris's face did not soften. It settled. Honey, howling is not the sin. Forgetting is. From then on, the bags continued, not every day, not enough to make Clara dependent, just often enough that beans gained tomatoes, oatmeal gained apple, and coffee returned to mornings when the marsh was too cold to meet without help. Doris never left food in a way that required public thanks. She placed it before dawn or after closing, when the shack had no audience except water and birds. Caleb came with a splitting maul over his shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle laid in the grass. He was 15, perhaps 16, all elbows and wrists with sandy hair escaping from beneath a red knit cap and a face still trying to decide what shape it would keep. The bicycle was blue, chipped along the frame, with a milk crate tied to the back by 2 lengths of clothesline. Its front tire hissed faintly every time he moved it, but he seemed not to notice. He arrived on a Saturday morning while Clara was carrying deadfall from behind the cedars. My mother said you needed wood split. Clara looked toward the lane, though no woman stood there. Who is your mother? Doris. That explained several things and raised others. I can split it. I did not say you could not. I cannot pay, my mother said. He set the bicycle carefully against the walnut, lifted the maul and walked to the chopping block, as if the matter had been signed before he was born. Clara watched his first swing and saw that he knew enough not to hurt himself immediately, but not enough to be left alone entirely. His stance was too narrow, his hands too close. The maul glanced off a twisted round and buried itself in wet ground. Widen your feet, she said. He looked at her, cheeks reddening. I know, then do. He did. They worked in a silence that became less awkward as the pile grew. Clara set rounds upright, Caleb split. She stacked under the lean-to roof with bark side up and air between rows. He refused water twice, accepted on the third offer, and drank from the tin cup with the solemnity of someone pretending not to need anything. His palms blistered by noon. He hid them badly. When she tried to give him $2, he stepped back. My mother said, About your grandfather. Clara closed her fingers around the bills. What did she say? That her father had a Ward black duck. Said it sat on their mantel through 3 hurricanes and 1 divorce. Said my grandfather would come out of the grave sideways if I took money for helping you keep warm. He lifted the maul again before she could answer. Caleb returned most Saturdays for 6 weeks. Sometimes he split wood, sometimes he carried salvage boards from the track, helped drag broken tin to a pile, or held a ladder while Clara scraped window trim. He rarely spoke first. When he did, it was about practical things, a pulley, a tire patch, a school assignment on Chesapeake watermen he had not begun. Clara showed him how to sharpen the hatchet on Everett's stone. He showed her where wild onions came up near the ditch. Neither of them called it friendship, because naming tender things too early can bruise them. Reverend Boyd passed every morning at 7:30. He was a tall, narrow man with dark skin, silver hair, and a black overcoat that had been brushed so faithfully the elbows shone. He served a church farther inland, but he walked the marsh road each morning before breakfast, because his doctor had warned him about the heart and his wife had warned him about ignoring doctors. At first, Clara saw him only from a distance, a figure moving along the raised track with a cane in one hand and a paper bag in the other, his hat brim low against wind. On the 5th morning, he stopped at the footpath and tipped his hat. Peace on this house. 4 words. Then he walked on. The next day he did the same, and the next. He did not come inside. He did not ask whether she had been saved, lost, fed, baptized, grateful or afraid. He only paused, tipped his hat, spoke the 4 words, and continued down the road with his measured step. Sometimes rain darkened his shoulders. Sometimes frost whitened the shell track beneath his shoes. Sometimes he lifted his cane to move a fallen branch from the path and left it neatly against the ditch. By April, Clara found herself listening for him before she saw him. His blessing became part of the morning order: stove, kettle, window light, Boyd's cane on shell. 4 words, then the day's work. Not once did he make kindness heavy. That was why it could be received. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. There was no reason for that date except that she had written it beside the word cellar on a scrap of paper and then obeyed herself. The door lay beneath a trap in the back room floor, half concealed by the rotted braided rug she had cut away weeks earlier. An iron ring lifted a panel of thick boards. When Clara first raised it, cold air came up with the mineral smell of stone, damp earth, and something older than dust. 7 granite steps led down. She held a lantern in one hand and the wall with the other. The steps were narrow, worn in the centre and slick at the edges. Granite did not rot, but it could still betray a careless foot. At the bottom, the cellar measured 12 feet by 15, fieldstone along the walls, earth packed hard between stone shelves, and a low ceiling supported by cedar beams blackened with age and cobweb. The floor was mostly fieldstone too, uneven but dry in the centre. Crocks stood along the north wall, empty except for flakes of salt and mouse husks. A barrel lay collapsed in iron hoops. Shelves held 3 cloudy jars sealed with wax, a bundle of rusted trap chain, and a broken oar blade. The air was colder than the room above, but steadier, as if seasons entered slowly and left reluctantly. Clara stood at the bottom and let the lantern light reach each corner before she moved. At the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It was rectangular, smoother than the surrounding stone, about 3 feet long and 2 wide, set into the floor with its edges tight. On its surface, someone had carved the Duck and Waves craft mark. The lines were shallow but clear, worn by no foot, because the slab seemed to resist being stepped on. Clara knelt beside it and brushed grit from the carving. The slab did not ask to be lifted. Not yet. It had the stillness of something that had been placed with intention larger than curiosity. Clara set her palm on it once. Cold entered her skin. Then she rose and turned away. There had been enough discovery for one winter. Some doors should remain doors until a person had built strength enough to honour what lay behind them. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something beneath the 3rd step. A small sound answered wood against stone. She held the lantern lower. There, wedged far back under the tread where dust and shadow had hidden it, was a small oak box no longer than a Bible. It had swollen slightly from damp, and its lid bore no latch. Clara worked it free with the flat of a chisel, careful not to splinter the step. Upstairs, near the stove, the lid opened with a dry complaint. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph wrapped in a strip of linen. The key was unlike the county keys. Its bow was shaped like the craft mark, a duck in profile riding 3 small waves, the cut of it delicate and deliberate. It had darkened green along one edge, but remained sound. Clara turned it in the light. It was too fine for a door, too narrow for the tool chest, too strange for any lock she had yet seen. The tintype was no larger than her palm. A young woman stood in front of the very shack, though the roofline in the photograph was sharper, the sign fresher, the porch straight. The woman wore a dark skirt, white blouse and apron marked with cedar dust. In one hand she held a carving knife, in the other a half-shaped decoy body. Her hair was pinned, but wind had loosened strands at her temples. Her face made Clara sit back from the stove. It was not Clara's face exactly. The woman's jaw was firmer, her mouth wider, her gaze more direct than Clara had ever allowed her own to be in photographs. Yet the line of cheek, the brow, the distance between eye and mouth, the careful way the hands held a tool as if holding a living promise. These things crossed time without asking permission. On the back, written in ink that had faded but not vanished, were the words, Miriam Ward, daughter of Thomas Ward, Edge 25, summer of 1903. Clara read it twice. Then she set the photograph on the shelf beside the letter and placed the brass key on the mantel above the stove. It caught the firelight and held it in the curved bow. She did not know what it opened. For the first time, not knowing did not feel like deprivation. It felt like being trusted with a future. Spring did not arrive all at once. It retreated, advanced, changed its mind and returned by smaller signs than calendars prefer. Snow withdrew first from the shell track, then from the shadowed edge of the walnut, then from the north side of the shack where cold had crouched longest. The creek grew loud with snow melt, running hard through the tidal gut until brown water braided itself with salt. Walnut catkins lengthened and trembled in the wind. The marsh shifted from winter straw toward a green so faint it could be seen only by someone who had watched daily. Birds came in greater number. Blackbirds stitched sound into the reeds. Gulls rode the wind with less complaint. Ducks moved at dawn in low dark lines, then settled beyond the channels where hunting had long ago become memory and lore. The chickadee returned to the walnut, or another chickadee took up the same branch and made the distinction unimportant. Reverend Boyd's coat grew lighter. Caleb arrived without gloves. Doris left rhubarb wrapped in newspaper and wrote on the bag, "Do not boil it to death." By then the shack had become livable in the honest, narrow meaning of the word. The roof held, the chimney drew, the floor took morning light, windows opened when coaxed and closed without needing wedges. The plaster patches dried pale and firm, wood stacked beneath the lean-to roof seasoned in tidy rows. The workbench had been cleaned, oiled, and left clear, except for the 2 knives, the letter, 1 pattern, and a small cedar block Clara had not yet cut. She did not begin carving that spring. The decision surprised people who knew only parts of the story. Everett asked once, not pressing, only curious. Doris said candles before decoys might be more forgiving. Caleb said he could cut rough blanks if she wanted, and then looked relieved when she said not yet. Clara had the tools. She had patterns, instructions, cedar, pigments, and more inheritance than she could understand in one season. But a craft is not entered because a door opens. It is entered when the hand has become truthful enough not to waste the threshold. She would order proper materials with 1 coin when the time came. 1 coin only, chosen with care from a bird whose belly she would close again afterward, a little hide glue, a safer modern substitute for anything poisonous, fresh linseed, a small packet of pigment, perhaps 2 cedar blocks from a mill that still understood air drying. She would practice first on scraps, cutting curves that did not matter, sanding breast lines no one would see, painting shadows on cedar chips until her wrist learned restraint. Spring, she decided, was for repair and listening. She washed the windows. She dug drainage away from the back step. She cleared dead vines from the well curb but did not open the water yet. She planted beans in 2 crates near the south wall and set onion ends in a broken enamel basin. She aired the emergency blanket, folded it, and placed it on the shelf, no longer her bed but not forgotten. She wrote payments into Everett's ledger whenever she earned $1 helping sort seed, clean shelves, or carry orders for customers who pretended not to notice her patched coat. On an April evening she stood in the doorway while the sunset moved across the marsh in low bands of rose and pewter. The sign above her had been cleaned but not repainted. Ward daughter Decoys remained faint, half vanished, still readable to anyone patient enough to look. The brass key rested on the mantel. The tintype watched from the shelf. The granite slab waited below without disturbance. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara finished her first true working bird. It was a black duck, because that was where Elias had begun with her, and because the marsh outside the window had taught her that plain birds carried the richest weather, she had not hurried toward it. Through the first year she practiced on scraps, shaping breast curves into firewood, painting feather patterns on cedar chips, ruining 3 heads before 1 bill held the proper humility. Through the second year she carved shorebirds not for sale but to learn balance, tool pressure, and the discipline of stopping before a thing became overworked. The black duck began as Atlantic white cedar dried in a loft near Pocomoke, bought with 1 gold coin exchanged through a careful dealer in Salisbury who had asked fewer questions than Clara feared and provided more receipts than she expected. She selected the billet by weight and sound, tapping it lightly with one knuckle as Elias had done. The grain ran straight, the scent rose clean when the saw opened it. She roughed the body on a cold morning while frost clouded the edges of the marsh window. Draw knife first, then rasp, then spoke shave. She hollowed the halves to the thickness Miriam had written, 3/8 inch, fuller at breast and tail. Hide glue warmed in a jar set inside water no hotter than the old instruction allowed. She tested it with a thermometer Everett had sold her, after declaring guesswork a poor religion. The halves clamped overnight beneath cloth. In the morning the seam held. The head took 4 attempts. The first was proud, the second delicate in the wrong way. The third looked like a duck drawn by someone trying to impress a duck. The fourth carried its bill low, its crown modest, its eye-line honest. She fixed it with a dowel and glue, then shaped the neck transition until there was no announcement where one part ended and another began. Painting took longer than carving. Underpaint first, umber lamp black, a little ochre drawn through the side while the dark remained open. She did not paint every feather. She painted what kept the bird alive, violet in the black where winter light would find it, warm brown beneath the breast, soft edges along the flank. The eye placed last, not because glass made life, but because a bird without the right gaze would never sit well in water or memory. On December 18th, she carried it outside before dawn. A thin skin of ice held in the shallow ditch, but the tidal gut moved dark beneath it. She set the decoy in the water with a leather anchor thong and watched it settle. It rocked once, turned with the light current, and faced into the wind as if it had decided that was where it belonged. Clara crouched at the edge with her hands tucked into her sleeves and did not smile widely. Wide smiles were for photographs and children. This was quieter. The bird rode true. Inside, the restored room had become itself without becoming new. The workbench stood beneath the south wall, oiled but still scarred. Tools hung on pegs according to use, not prettiness. Draw knife, spoke shaves, gouges, rasps, awls, dividers, and Elias's knife beside Miriam's. Pigments sat in labelled jars on a shelf, modern where safety required, traditional where prudence allowed. The stove had been blacked, its pipes straightened, its hearth laid with salvaged brick. The floor glowed dark honey into mahogany wherever winter light touched it. The plaster patches had cured into the wall, visible only if one knew where to look. The original window bent the walnut branches each morning into a wavering, merciful shape. In the back room, an iron bed now held a real mattress bought second-hand from a church sale and aired for 3 days in sun. A wool blanket lay folded at the foot. The emergency blanket remained on the shelf above it, silver and creased, not needed but kept. On the wall hung the tintype, the letter framed between 2 sheets of glass, and a small note in Clara's hand listing the names she had learned from records, cemetery stones, military rolls, and Mrs. Pritchard's courthouse books. The brass key waited longer than anything else. For nearly 2 years it stayed on the mantel, catching stovelight, resisting every lock Clara thought to try. It did not fit the cellar slab, the tool chest, the front door, the back door, the drawer in the workbench, the trunk Everett found at an estate sale, or the padlock on the shed after Tom insisted she needed one. Caleb joked once that the key opened patience, and then apologized because he thought he had sounded foolish. Clara told him he might be right. The answer appeared after a storm. A nor'easter came through in early December, hard enough to strip dead limbs from the cedars and drive water over the lower path. Clara stayed inside while the shack took the weather. The roof held, the windows trembled but did not fail. The walnut groaned all night in the dark. Near dawn, when wind dropped from fury to argument, something heavy cracked outside with a sound like a rifle shot softened by rain. A limb had fallen from the walnut. Not the main branch, but a lower one near the south side, close enough to the horseshoe that Clara went out with her coat thrown over her nightdress. Rain still fell in cold slanting lines. The fallen limb had torn bark from the trunk as it went, exposing a darker oval beneath a shelf of grown wood. At first Clara thought it was rot, then she saw brass. A plate had been set into the trunk long ago and the tree had grown around it, nearly covering the edges. Only the storm tear had revealed its lower half. The plate was green-black, with a keyhole no wider than a thumbnail. Clara went back inside for the key. It fit. Not easily. Time had crowded the mechanism. She worked oil into it over 3 days, covering the exposed place with canvas between attempts. On the 4th morning, with Everett standing behind her and Tom leaning on his cane as if disinterest had brought him by accident, the key turned. A small door opened in the tree. Inside the hollow, lined with tin and sealed with waxed canvas, lay a folded flag and a note. The flag had 48 stars, the cloth faded but carefully kept, folded into a triangle small enough to fit the chamber. It smelled faintly of cedar and metal. The note was wrapped separately, written in the same hand as the letter but dated earlier than Clara expected, June 14th, 1918. Miriam had written it after her brother Caleb left for training and before the telegram arrived. The note was brief, much shorter than the letter, perhaps because fear makes some people plain. If this flag is found, let it be known that Caleb Ward carried no hatred with him when he left this marsh. He said he went because some fields far away had been made unfit for sons to stand in, and no mother should have to learn the names of foreign mud. If he does not return, hang this once each year where the water can see it, not for victory, for memory. M.W.A. Clara read it aloud under the walnut because Everett asked her to, and Tom looked at the ground. The 3 of them stood there in the cold, the opened tree between them, the flag in Clara's arms. No one made a ceremony of it that day. Ceremony would come later, after the cloth had been examined, cleaned only as much as preservation allowed, and folded again by hands that understood flags better than grief. The medal from the hidden decoy found its place the next spring. Clara had learned the engraved name by then, Caleb Ward, Company E, 116th Infantry, 29th Division. She had found his service record, his death near the Meuse Argonne in October 1918, and his marker in the veterans section of the cemetery at Downing's United Methodist Church, inland from the marsh where cedar gave way to fields. The stone was not grand. It stood among others, each one holding a name, a date, and more silence than any inscription could bear. On November 11th, Veterans Day, Clara carried the medal there, wrapped in blue cloth. She did not leave it to weather. Instead she held it while Reverend Boyd read the 4 lines of scripture the family had chosen for soldiers, then placed it against the stone only long enough for its metal to touch the carved name. Afterward, she wrapped it again and brought it home. Memory, she had learned, was not always surrendering an object. Sometimes it was carrying it back with more care than before. The money remained mostly where it had been. That surprised people who heard rumours and misunderstood them into larger rumours. Clara did not buy a car, she did not replace the shack with a house on pilings high enough to insult the marsh, she did not purchase new dresses, polished furniture, or a sign big enough to be seen from the road. 3 coins had been spent in the first year, 1 to buy cedar and safe materials, 1 to pay county fees connected to the conservation boundary, and 1 to settle the oldest portion of Everett's ledger after he threatened to frame the unpaid pages as modern art. A 4th coin went toward proper preservation of the flag and letter. The rest returned to the birds. She cleaned nothing beyond what preservation required. She wrapped the coins, notes, and receipts in acid-free paper, after learning the term from a museum volunteer in Onencock who treated Clara's questions with respect. The miniature decoys went back into the tin into the cedar chest, and the false bottom closed again, not hidden in fear, now kept in order. Clara added a page to the ledger sheet, listing every coin used, every purpose, every date, and the remaining count. At the bottom she wrote, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris made that happen by placing a 3x5 index card on the corkboard inside Heron's Wake Diner, between a notice for fresh eggs and a lost cat named Pearl. The card was cream-coloured, written in Clara's careful block letters. Ward daughter decoys, hand-carved working birds, repairs, commissions, and bayberry candles. Inquire by mail or at Heron's wake. There was no phone number at first because the shack still had no phone. There was no website because Clara could not imagine what a website would know about the smell of cedar under a draw knife. Doris added a small envelope beneath the card for names. By the end of the first month, 8 people had written themselves in. By summer, 21. By the second winter, 43 names waited on folded slips. Hunters who still used legal rigs with reverence, collectors tired of glossy things, grandchildren seeking repairs to birds their grandfathers had left, and one woman from Ohio who wanted a black duck because her father had described them until the day he died. Clara answered each request by mail. Slow work. She wrote, no two alike. Repairs considered. Waiting list kept in order received. Some people withdrew when they learned the time required. That was useful. The right customers understood that a bird made quickly would always look slightly ashamed. Candles paid Doris first. Bayberry was expensive, and Clara did not pretend to make pure bayberry candles by the dozen. She blended bayberry wax with beeswax, labelled it honestly, and poured them in small batches using a double boiler, cotton wicks, and thrifted moulds cleaned until they shone. Each candle carried a paper band stamped with the duck and waves mark. The first dozen went to Heron's wake in a wooden crate Caleb had made in shop class. Doris placed them by the register. In candles when the shop reopens, she said. Lifting one. Clara handed her a receipt. Doris looked at it, then at Clara. You made a receipt for kindness. I made a receipt for candles, Doris grunted. But she kept it in the cash drawer. Caleb returned with the sign on a cold afternoon in January. He was taller then, no longer all elbows, though the red cap remained and the Schwinn had been replaced by a battered pickup he shared with an uncle. In the truck bed lay a wooden sign wrapped in a quilt. He had carved it himself from cedar boards, letters raised by careful chisel work, the edges beveled, the surface painted cream and dark green. Clara knew before he unwrapped it what it would say, and still she was not ready. Ward daughters decoys. Plural. She stood in the yard beside the walnut, hands at her sides, while Caleb held the sign against his coat and pretended not to watch her face. The old one is about gone, he said. Yes, I copied the letters from photographs. Mostly. Yes, my mother said the S was important. Clara looked at the final letter. The added S did not shout. It sat at the end with quiet certainty, as though it had been waiting outside the word all these years for someone to make room. Daughters. Not because Clara had a daughter, not because Miriam's line had been neat, legal, or uninterrupted in the way courthouse charts preferred, because women's hands had been in the work, in the keeping, in the repairing, in the hunger and the waiting, even when signs, ledgers and buyers had forgotten to name them. I cannot pay enough for that, she said. Caleb shifted. I did not ask enough. She smiled then. Small but present. They hung it together above the door. Everett came to supervise uninvited. Tom came to say the left side was a hair low, then admitted the hair might be his eye. Reverend Boyd passed during the work, tipped his hat, and said his 4 words. Doris arrived late with coffee in a thermos, and stood back from the path, arms folded, looking at the sign as if it had personally repaid several debts. When the last screw seated, the wind moved across the marsh and lifted the smell of cedar from the fresh-cut letters. Clara kept the first sign. She brought it inside, brushed salt dust from the faint words, and hung it over the workbench, where it could remain not as advertisement, but as witness. That same winter, Clara began writing her own letter. She did not know who would read it, that was the point. The proper recipient of inheritance is often someone unnamed, someone not yet born, someone walking through rain toward a courthouse with less money than hope. She chose thick paper from the stationer in a komack and a fountain pen Mrs. Pritchard gave her after retirement, claiming it leaked and therefore suited government work no longer. Clara tested the nib on scrap until her hand stopped trying to imitate Miriam and found its own slower slant. She began with the same words, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped for nearly a week. Some openings are large enough to require a person to grow into them. She did not want to write a performance of wisdom. She had been rescued too often by exactness to insult the future with vague comfort, so she made notes first: roof dimensions, chimney mortar ratios, where the sash weights like to jam, which floorboards should never be sanded again, the safe pigment substitutions, the dealer who treated coins honestly, the preservation volunteer's address, the day the heron stood in the tidal gut, the names of people whose kindness had become part of the foundation. She wrote about the money plainly. Use what keeps the work alive. Do not use it to become impressive. She wrote about the marsh. It is not empty land. It is a living boundary. Walk lightly. Leave nesting places alone. Do not cut the cedars without need. Do not trust anyone who calls fill dirt opportunity. She wrote about craft. Wait before the first cut. Paint less than vanity asks. Learn the bird before shaping the bird. If your hand trembles, sharpen instead. If your pride swells, sweep the floor. If grief comes, let it sit by the stove, but do not give it the knife. She wrote about being welcomed, not as Miriam had written it, because those words belonged to the letter that had found her. Clara wrote what she knew now, that a place can receive a person without flattering them, that repair is sometimes the truest form of belonging, and that a life can begin again without applause. Near the end, she left a blank space for future details she had not yet earned. Then she folded the unfinished pages, placed them in an envelope, and set them in the cedar chest, not in the false bottom. Not yet. It was too soon to hide them. She was still adding one honest thing. By the third Christmas in the shack, the mailing list had passed 50 names. 3 completed birds had left the shop, and 2 had come back for minor adjustments because Clara insisted they be tested in water before any customer trusted her. The bayberry candles sold slowly but steadily. The beans in the crate garden had failed the first year and improved the second. The well, after testing and cleaning, produced water fit for washing but not drinking, which was more than Clara had dared hope. The outhouse door no longer swung from one hinge. The back step had been rebuilt. The granite slab in the cellar remained untouched. The brass key, after opening the walnut, hung beside the flag note in a small frame. Every June 14th, Clara hung the preserved 48-star flag inside the shop window where sunlight could not strike it directly, but the water could see its shape. She did not leave it all day. An hour was enough. The note had asked that it be hung where the water could see it, not where weather could take it again. Afterward, she folded it along its proper lines and returned it to its archival box with clean hands. The miniature flock remained beneath the false bottom. Sometimes on nights when cold pressed hard and the stove burned low, Clara opened the chest and looked at the birds without opening their bellies. They had become less like money to her and more like guardians of restraint. Each small duck held a choice: not to spend, not to hurry, not to convert every saved thing into comfort. The world outside still prized loud transformation before and after photographs. Public triumph, a face turned toward applause. The shack taught another lesson. The deepest changes often looked from the road, like a thin line of smoke rising cleanly from a chimney that had once been unsound. Clara did not become famous. No magazine came with lights. No wealthy buyer discovered her and lifted her beyond ordinary life. Vernon did not return. No apology arrived wrapped in legal paper. Her mother's blue bowl remained gone. The lost photographs remained lost. Some rooms in the past stay locked even after a person finds better keys, but she woke each morning in a place that allowed her to remain. She made coffee in a dented pot, opened the stove, checked the tide, and stood for a moment beneath the sign Caleb had carved. She swept the floor because cedar dust deserved respect. She answered letters. She sharpened tools. She walked to town on clear days and paid Everett's ledger in patient amounts until the old brown book showed more credits than debt. She left candles at the diner door without a note. She waved to Reverend Boyd when his walking slowed and later visited him when walking became difficult. She taught Caleb to hollow cedar safely, though he still wanted to rush the tail line. And in the evenings, when the marsh turned silver and dark birds crossed low over the channels, Clara lit one candle and set it on the bench near Miriam's letter. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. There are places like that, though most people pass them without seeing. A leaning shed at the end of a drowned road, a workshop behind blackberry canes, a smokehouse with one hinge left, a boathouse sinking by inches into reeds. They look abandoned because human impatience has no category for patient things, but wood remembers touch, iron remembers heat, rooms remember voices, even after the people who made them have gone quiet. A decoy carver's shack waits. It has always waited. And somewhere in the Accomack County Clerk's office, in a desk that now belongs to someone younger than Mrs. Pritchard, and less severe about penmanship, one worn dollar bill remains flattened beneath a glass paperweight in the back of the drawer. Its corner is still darkened from the heat of a public library hand dryer. Mrs. Pritchard placed it there on her last day before retirement, after exchanging 4 crisp bills of her own into the county deposit years earlier, and keeping that one because procedure, she decided, could survive a single mercy. The young clerk who inherited the desk does not know why the bill is there. She only knows not to move it.